My gold digger son-in-law thought I was just a clueless old man. He drained my daughter's accounts and brought armed loan sharks to rob my abandoned warehouse of $23 million in platinum. He didn't know the warehouse was actually a highly classified federal transport hub. I watched them destroy him. My name is Leland. I am 69 years old, and I spent my life building an empire from the shadows. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a greedy relative a lesson they will never forget. The clinking of fine crystal and the low hum of jazz filled my daughter Kendra's dining room, masking the underlying tension that always accompanied these gatherings. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table, nursing a simple glass of tap water. Bradley, my white son-in-law, stood at the head of the table. He was holding court over a dozen men and women dressed in sharp designer suits. He was pitching his latest phantom business venture to these supposed investors, desperate to secure their backing. I wore my faded gray suit, the same one I wore to church every Sunday. It was clean and perfectly pressed, but next to the tailored Italian wool dominating the room, it stood out loudly. Bradley made absolute sure everyone noticed my presence. He gestured toward me with a half-empty glass of imported Burgundy. He instructed his guests with a loud theatrical sigh not to mind the quiet old man in the corner. He introduced me to the wealthy crowd as a glorified janitor who sweeps the concrete floors of dusty storage units down by the industrial docks. A few of the investors chuckled politely into their napkins. They cast pitying, dismissive glances in my direction. Bradley thrived on this specific kind of public belittlement. He constantly needed to shrink me down to inflate his own fragile ego. I registered the insult instantly, noting the exact arrogant tone of his voice and the cruel smirk on his face. I maintained absolute silence. I did not shift in my chair. I did not lower my gaze. I simply looked directly at him. I have learned over many decades of hard work that a quiet, observant man always makes loud men deeply nervous. I shifted my focus away from Bradley's obnoxious laughter and began to critically analyze the table. My eyes traced the elegant labels on the wine bottles scattered among the massive floral centerpieces. They were vintage Bordeaux, easily running $400 a bottle. The catered food was equally extravagant and entirely out of place. Uniformed servers carried heavy silver plates of seared Wagyu beef and truffled risotto. I knew exactly what Kendra brought home every month. My daughter was a fiercely dedicated high school principal. She worked tirelessly for her community, but her salary in the public education system was a matter of public record. It certainly did not cover the cost of private chefs' premium catering staff and cases of vintage French wine. Bradley relentlessly claimed to be a visionary tech entrepreneur. Yet in the 4 years he had been married to Kendra, I had never seen a single profitable product or service emerge from his endless stream of grandiose pitches. I calculated the basic arithmetic of the evening in my head. The expensive catering, the imported wine, the rented crystal glasses, and the sudden influx of flashy technology hardware in their living room painted a very clear, very dangerous financial picture. The math was entirely impossible. The luxurious lifestyle they were projecting tonight required a massive influx of cash that neither of them legitimately possessed. I did not need to ask intrusive questions to understand that a serious financial breach had occurred within their household. My mind is professionally trained to find discrepancies in complex ledgers and global logistics. It was the exact analytical skill set that allowed me to build a massive, lucrative enterprise, while the rest of the world thought I was merely managing rusty padlocks. Bradley grabbed a heavy silver spoon and tapped it sharply against his crystal wine glass. The sharp, piercing, ringing sound cut cleanly through the ambient jazz music, demanding the immediate and undivided attention of everyone in the room. He smoothed the sharp lapels of his suit jacket and flashed a brilliant, highly rehearsed smile. He confidently announced that tonight was not just a simple dinner party, but a vital celebration of a major corporate milestone. He raised his glass high into the air and projected his voice so the entire house could hear his declaration. Bradley declared that he had officially secured a massive injection of capital for his new startup company. He spoke at length about disruptive technology and changing the fundamental landscape of modern business. He then puffed out his chest, completely filled with his own pride, and revealed the actual source of his newfound wealth. He proudly announced to the crowded room that he had officially secured a $400,000 second mortgage on the house. He aggressively framed the decision as a bold entrepreneurial move, pitching it as a necessary and brilliant sacrifice to fund his genius. He spoke enthusiastically about leveraging personal assets and taking calculated risks to build a wealthy future for his family. He sounded completely triumphant, happily basking in the warm glow of his own perceived brilliance. The investors nodded approvingly, raising their expensive glasses in a cheerful toast to his daring financial strategy. Bradley beamed from ear to ear, absorbing the validation he so desperately craved from his peers. He looked exactly like a man who had just conquered the world entirely blind to the massive destruction he had just unleashed. I did not look at the cheering investors. My eyes locked instantly onto Kendra. She sat completely rigidly near the kitchen archway. The heavy silver fork slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against her delicate porcelain plate. The sound was sharp, metallic, and violent, cutting directly through the cheerful applause of the oblivious guests. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking hollow, sick, and utterly terrified. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid as her chest heaved under the weight of the revelation. I recognized the devastating look of a person whose entire reality had just been violently shattered without warning. She knew absolutely nothing about a second mortgage. The house was the only major asset. She owned a property she had worked grueling years to secure long before Bradley even entered the picture. The guests continued to clap and cheer, completely oblivious to the silent, crushing tragedy unfolding at the other end of the table. Kendra stared directly at Bradley in sheer, unadulterated horror. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She was entirely paralyzed by the sudden, sickening realization that the man she married had secretly collateralized her entire future behind her back. Bradley casually caught her eye across the room and offered a dismissive, reassuring wink, fundamentally failing to grasp the gravity of his massive betrayal. The festive atmosphere of the dining room pressed heavily against the suffocating silence radiating from my daughter. I felt a cold, deeply familiar switch flip in my mind. Bradley had officially moved from being a pathetic, arrogant nuisance to an active, dangerous threat to my family. The dinner party roared on, completely unaware that a devastating war had just begun. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind the final departing investor. The manufactured warmth of the dinner party evaporated instantly, replaced by a suffocating, hostile chill that settled over the dining room. Kendra marched directly into the kitchen, her hands shaking violently as she confronted her husband. Her voice cracked with sheer betrayal as she demanded to know how a second mortgage had been authorized on a property she had purchased completely on her own long before their wedding day. She asked him how he could possibly leverage the only secure asset they possessed without uttering a single word of discussion. Bradley leaned against the polished granite island, pouring himself another glass of imported wine with infuriating, calculated casualness. He attempted to gaslight her immediately to shut down her rising panic. He claimed it was standard corporate leverage and insisted she simply lacked the financial intellect to comprehend high-level venture capitalism. He told her to calm down and stop acting like an irrational child in front of him. I stepped out of the shadows of the dining room and walked into the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. I did not raise my voice or show a fraction of the anger burning inside my chest. I extended my right hand and calmly demanded to see the physical loan documents resting inside the black leather folder on the counter. Bradley snapped instantly. The polished, charismatic entrepreneur vanished completely, revealing the volatile, desperate man hiding underneath the expensive suit. He lunged across the kitchen tiles and aggressively shoved me backward by both shoulders. The sudden, violent physical impact forced my spine hard against the stainless steel refrigerator. Kendra screamed his name in absolute shock. Bradley ignored her completely. He snatched the leather folder off the granite surface, clutching the documents tightly against his chest like a physical shield. He glared at me, his face flushed with sudden, unchecked rage, breathing heavily through his teeth as he prepared to escalate the violence. Bradley pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face, stepping closer to invade my physical space. He sneered, his upper lip curling with pure, unfiltered disgust as he looked at my faded church suit. He ordered me to mind my own pathetic business and stay completely out of his complex financial affairs. He called me a useless relic, a clueless old man who needed to stick to pushing a dirty broom across the concrete floors of empty storage units. He puffed out his chest, asserting absolute dominance over the household and attempting to physically intimidate me. He aggressively proclaimed that he was the true provider, now the undeniable master of the estate, actively securing a multi-million-dollar future while I was nothing more than a pathetic drain on their emotional resources. Kendra stepped between us, her voice breaking into a sob as she ordered him to back away and stop disrespecting her father in her own home. but the sudden, jarring escalation into physical violence had left her entirely paralyzed, deeply terrified of the stranger her husband had just become. I looked at Bradley's flushed, sweating face and his rapidly dilating pupils. I did not argue with his insults. I did not shout back or attempt to defend my honor to a man who possessed none. Arguing with a desperate, cornered animal is always a severe tactical error. I simply locked my eyes onto his, registering the precise mathematical level of threat he now actively posed to my bloodline. I memorized the arrogant smirk returning to his face as he foolishly mistook my calculated silence for cowardly submission. I turned my back on the escalating screaming match echoing through the kitchen. I walked straight down the hallway, opened the heavy front door, and stepped out into the cool, damp night air. I climbed into my reliable, faded pickup truck and drove away, leaving the chaotic, fracturing house far behind me in the rearview mirror. I parked my faded truck in the cracked driveway of my modest single-story brick house on the quiet, unassuming side of town. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside the dark hallway, bypassing the living room television and my comfortable recliner completely. I walked straight into my back study, locked the solid wooden door behind me, and forcefully rolled back the thick Persian rug covering the center of the floor. I knelt on the hardwood boards, pressed my thumb against a concealed biometric scanner, and opened the heavy steel floor safe hidden deep beneath the concrete foundation. I reached inside the dark cavity and extracted a thick, military-grade, fully encrypted laptop. I placed the heavy machine on my desk and rapidly booted the highly customized operating system. The screen flared to life, illuminating my face in the dark room with a cool blue glow. The interface did not display a standard retirement portfolio or a modest senior citizen pension plan. It displayed the highly secure active global dashboard of Sector 4 Logistics. I did not manage a handful of dusty storage units down by the commercial docks, as Bradley loudly claimed. Over the last 4 decades, I had quietly built and become the sole owner of a massive, heavily fortified logistics empire. My company specialized in the highly secure, untraceable transportation of classified federal assets and high-value materials across the country. I deliberately maintained the public persona of a humble, working-class elderly man to remain entirely invisible to corporate predators, aggressive competitors, and the general public. Bradley firmly believed I was a financially illiterate janitor completely incapable of understanding his complex business jargon. He had absolutely no idea that he had just aggressively assaulted a man who controlled a multi-million-dollar corporate infrastructure and employed teams of highly trained private security contractors. I cracked my knuckles and immediately bypassed the standard civilian firewalls protecting the county public property registry. My fingers flew across the keyboard with the practiced aggressive speed of a man who had spent his entire life hunting down corporate espionage and digital fraud. I pulled up the official digital file for Kendra's residential deed and isolated the newly attached second mortgage documents that Bradley had filed. I magnified the primary signature block on the high-resolution screen, scrutinizing every single pixel of the ink stroke. To the untrained eye, it looked like a flawless, perfect replica of my daughter's handwriting. But I knew her signature intimately, and my security software instantly highlighted the digital timestamp discrepancies embedded deep within the electronic submission. Bradley had legally and systematically stolen $400,000 in hard equity directly from his own wife. I did not stop my investigation there. I isolated the specific financial routing numbers listed in the bank's loan disbursement file. I initiated a deep, aggressive digital trace through international banking protocols to see exactly where the capital had landed after leaving the domestic branch. The massive sum of money was not deposited into any legitimate business account. It was not funding a revolutionary new tech startup in Silicon Valley. The trace confirmed the funds were instantly wired to a heavily obscured offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I ran the shell company's identification markers through my private corporate security database to uncover the true ownership structure. The system flashed a bright, undeniable red warning across my screen. The offshore account did not belong to venture capitalists or angel investors. It belonged directly to the Volkov Syndicate, a notoriously violent, highly organized criminal network known primarily for predatory lending, brutal extortion, and aggressive asset seizure. Bradley had not secured a business investment. He had borrowed dirty money from lethal loan sharks, lost it completely, and handed them the keys to my daughter's home. The morning air hung heavy with humidity as I waited beside the pristine white mailbox at the end of Kendra's sprawling driveway. Bradley stepped out of the heavy front door holding a sleek leather briefcase and whistling a cheerful, incredibly arrogant tune. He stopped dead in his tracks the exact moment he saw me, firmly blocking his path to his imported sports car. His signature patronizing smirk immediately stretched across his face as he prepared to deliver another rapid barrage of insults regarding my uninvited presence on his property. I did not give him the opportunity to speak a single word. I reached inside my faded corduroy jacket, extracted a single crisp sheet of printer paper, and held it up directly at his eye level. It was the complete, undeniable digital footprint of his $400,000 offshore wire transfer, complete with the forged signature authentication log explicitly printed at the bottom. Bradley's smug expression dissolved in a fraction of a second. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His eyes darted frantically up and down the quiet suburban street, absolutely terrified that someone might be watching us. The confident, wealthy venture capitalist vanished completely, replaced by the cornered, desperate fraud he truly was. He lunged forward suddenly to snatch the paper from my hands. I anticipated his erratic movement and simply folded the document back into my pocket with practiced, fluid efficiency. I looked at him with absolute detachment, silently waiting for his surging panic to manifest into his next massive tactical error. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tightly tailored dress shirt. He realized instantly that his entire financial illusion was currently resting safely inside the breast pocket of a man he had publicly humiliated just 12 hours prior. Bradley quickly closed the distance between us, stepping aggressively into my personal space in a pathetic, desperate attempt at physical intimidation. His previous terror rapidly morphed into a cornered, vicious fury. He lowered his voice to a hostile, venomous whisper, ensuring his harsh words would not carry back to the house where Kendra was getting ready for work. He told me that I was nothing but a broken old man holding a useless piece of paper. He then issued a direct, uncompromising threat. He stated clearly that if I dared to show that financial document to my daughter, he would manipulate her into cutting off all contact with me forever. He promised to pack her bags, move her across the country, and ensure I died alone in my dusty house without ever seeing her or my future grandchildren again. He puffed out his chest, asserting that Kendra loved him blindly and would absolutely believe his polished lies over the delirious ramblings of an aging janitor. I stood my ground, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady, mathematically analyzing the psychological leverage he was attempting to apply. He was utilizing the oldest, most desperate weapon in the abuser's arsenal, explicitly threatening the total isolation of a parent from their only child. I did not flinch or offer any emotional reaction to his brutal ultimatum. I simply cataloged the threat for future retribution. Men who resort to threatening the theft of a bloodline are men who have entirely exhausted all other avenues of power. His hostile posture did not project strength, it actively broadcasted a profound terminal weakness. He glared at me, his jaw clenched tight, waiting for me to break down or beg for mercy. Instead, I gave him nothing but a cold, unyielding silence. My unshakable silence unnerved him deeply, but my mind was entirely focused on the specific routing details printed on the paper resting inside my jacket. During my 30 years building Sector 4 logistics, I had transported highly classified assets through the most dangerous commercial territories in the nation. Operating a massive logistics network requires an intimate encyclopedic knowledge of the criminal underbelly that constantly attempts to infiltrate global supply chains. I immediately recognized the alphanumeric sequence of the offshore destination account. It did not belong to a legitimate offshore investment firm or a secretive tech incubator. It belonged directly to the Volkov Syndicate. The Volkovs were a notoriously violent, highly organized criminal network operating out of the eastern seaboard, known primarily for predatory lending, illegal gambling rings, and brutal extortion tactics. They did not invest in software startups. They financed desperation and collected their returns in blood. I understood the total scope of the situation instantly. Bradley had not simply made a poor business decision or lost money on a bad investment. He had borrowed dirty capital from lethal loan sharks, lost it completely, and subsequently forged his wife's signature to steal the equity from her home just to keep himself breathing. He was severely, irreversibly compromised. The Volkovs do not accept polite apologies or extended restructuring plans. They demand full payment with exorbitant interest, and they aggressively seize assets by force when payments inevitably fail. By bringing their dirty money into his life, Bradley had unwittingly placed a massive invisible target directly on Kendra's back. My daughter was now legally tethered to a man who owed a fortune to ruthless killers. The time for passive observation was officially over. I needed to systematically dismantle this threat before they reached her. Before Bradley could issue another desperate threat, the sharp screech of heavy rubber tires against the asphalt tore through the quiet morning air. A massive black SUV with heavily tinted windows swerved violently into the driveway, cutting Bradley off from his sports car and permanently blocking any potential avenue of escape. The heavy doors swung open simultaneously. Two towering, broad-shouldered men in dark tactical jackets stepped out onto the concrete. They did not look like Silicon Valley venture capitalists or affluent tech investors. They moved with the aggressive, coordinated efficiency of seasoned cartel enforcers. Bradley let out a sharp gasp, his brief display of false bravado instantly evaporating into the humid air. The larger of the two men grabbed Bradley roughly by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him violently backward against the hood of his car. The metal buckled slightly under the harsh impact. The thug leaned in close, his voice a low, gravelly growl demanding their scheduled weekly payment immediately. He explicitly reminded Bradley that patience was a commodity their employers simply did not possess. The second enforcer stood guard, slowly turning his head to lock his cold, dead eyes directly onto me. He actively scanned my faded jacket, my work boots, and my calm posture, visibly calculating if the old man standing in the driveway held any monetary value or posed any physical threat. I held his gaze without blinking, expertly masking the lethal tactical assessment running through my mind. I was entirely unarmed, standing feet away from two syndicate collectors who were ready to extract their debt by any means necessary. The suburban driveway had instantly transformed into an active hostile zone. Bradley choked out a frantic, trembling plea for mercy as the enforcer reached inside his coat. The enforcer's heavy grip loosened abruptly, dropping Bradley onto the wet concrete of the driveway. Bradley scrambled backward, scraping his palms against the rough pavement, begging frantically for a final extension. He promised a massive, life-changing payout by the end of the month, swearing to the thugs that he had a guaranteed score capable of clearing his principal debt and the astronomical interest in one single payment. The enforcer stared down at him with cold eyes entirely devoid of human empathy. He delivered a final, chilling promise that if the debt was not settled in full by Friday at midnight, the syndicate would bypass Bradley entirely and start extracting their payment directly from his wife. The enforcers climbed back into the heavily tinted SUV, and the vehicle tore out of the quiet suburban neighborhood, leaving a thick trail of burnt rubber in its wake. Bradley remained on his hands and knees, gasping for air, clutching his chest as if he had just survived a massive heart attack. I did not move to help him up. I watched him pull a perfectly pressed handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the dirt from his face, desperately trying to reconstruct his shattered illusion of control. I understood the dire reality of the situation with absolute freezing clarity. Bradley had just sold a phantom score to buy himself a few miserable days of borrowed time. His life was already mathematically forfeit, but the true threat was the collateral damage. By explicitly promising a guaranteed payout, he had painted a massive, glowing bullseye directly onto my daughter. Kendra was completely oblivious to the lethal danger currently standing in her front yard. I turned away from the pathetic sight of my son-in-law and walked back to my truck. I needed to shift my operations from passive surveillance to active defense immediately. I drove my faded pickup truck out of the manicured suburbs and headed straight into the heavy industrial district on the outskirts of the city. I bypassed the dilapidated public storage facilities that Bradley publicly mocked me for managing. I navigated down a restricted private access road that vanished behind a dense line of industrial pines. The road terminated at the heavily fortified primary gates of Sector 4 Logistics. This facility was not a collection of rusty padlocks and neglected concrete bays. It was a sprawling, impenetrable fortress. 12-foot-high fencing topped with razor wire and electrified anti-climb netting surrounded the entire perimeter. Heavily armed private security contractors patrolled the grounds with tactical precision, carrying out protocols I had personally established decades ago. I pulled up to the reinforced steel barricade and rolled down my window. The perimeter guard immediately recognized my face, snapping to a strict posture of absolute respect before keying his radio to lower the hydraulic bollards. I drove my beat-up truck through the checkpoints and parked in my designated heavily monitored spot near the central command hub. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the primary administrative building. The air inside hummed with the quiet, intense energy of high-level logistical operations. I bypassed the busy analysts on the main floor and headed straight for my private, soundproofed office at the end of the restricted corridor. I needed to leverage the full technological weight of my empire to dissect Bradley's desperate promise to the syndicate. I locked my heavy office door, lowered the blackout blinds, and booted up my primary terminal. The moment my encrypted connection hit the central servers, the system immediately greeted me with a blaring, flashing warning that demanded my absolute attention. A severe critical red alert pulsed across the center of my primary monitor, signaling a recent unauthorized breach attempt on our highly restricted digital archives. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as I commanded the security software to trace the origin and methodology of the digital intrusion. The firewall logs populated instantly, revealing a brazen attempt to bypass our internal security grids from an external unsecured IP address. My blood ran cold when I saw the specific credentials used to hammer against the system. The intruder was attempting to force entry using Kendra's outdated employee login. Over a decade ago, long before she pursued her career in education, Kendra had worked a summer internship in the routing department of Sector 4 Logistics. I had insisted she learn the fundamental mechanics of hard labor and supply chain management. Her digital profile had been deactivated and archived the day she left for college, buried deep within our legacy servers. Whoever was attacking the firewall possessed intimate, highly specific knowledge of her past. They were desperately trying to use her long-dead credentials to pry open the back doors of my corporate network. The system had successfully blocked the gross intrusion, immediately locking down the compromised port and initiating a silent traceback protocol. I watched the automated countermeasure pinpoint the exact geographical location of the attacking computer. The IP address did not originate from a sophisticated hacker collective or a rival corporate entity. The signal bounced off a local cellular tower and landed directly inside my daughter's suburban home. The pathetic, arrogant man who had belittled my life's work was actively utilizing my own daughter's identity to rob me blind. I cracked my knuckles and escalated my access privileges to the highest executive tier. I initiated a remote override utilizing a dormant tracking program embedded within Kendra's personal home network to protect her from external digital threats. I seamlessly bypassed Bradley's weak personal firewall and hijacked the integrated camera on the laptop he was actively using. The live video feed flickered onto my monitor, displaying Bradley sitting at Kendra's pristine home desk. His face was slick with terrified sweat as he frantically hammered the keyboard, entirely unaware that the man he viewed as a glorified janitor was currently watching his every single keystroke in high definition. I pulled up the exact server logs of his digital activity to see exactly what he was desperately hunting for. He had managed to scrape a fragment of an outdated, unencrypted cache file containing old transit manifests. I watched the live screen capture as Bradley rapidly scrolled through hundreds of pages of logistical routing data. He suddenly stopped, his eyes widening with sheer, unadulterated greed as he locked onto a specific, high-priority archival document. The file detailed a heavy transport scheduled for arrival at our most isolated facility, Warehouse 7. Bradley zoomed in on the primary cargo description. The text clearly and explicitly labeled the incoming freight as high-grade industrial platinum bearing an estimated street value of $23 million. Bradley pumped his fist in the air, a sickening smile of absolute triumph spreading across his face. He quickly downloaded the routing schematic and the warehouse blueprints to a portable flash drive. He genuinely believed he had just discovered the ultimate financial salvation to clear his lethal debts with the Volkov Syndicate. He had absolutely no idea that the manifest he was holding was entirely obsolete and he was walking straight into a catastrophic trap. I sat back in my secure office chair, the chilling reality of Bradley's digital intrusion settling over me like a heavy shroud. He was not looking for a quick cash loan. He was actively planning a multi-million-dollar heist against a fortified logistics hub to save his own miserable life. He genuinely believed that the outdated manifest he had stolen would grant him access to $23 million in industrial platinum. He was a cornered rat willing to sacrifice my company and my daughter's safety to appease the Volkov Syndicate. I locked down my terminal, wiped the access logs, and exited the administrative building, maintaining my facade as a tired, unremarkable old man finishing a long shift. I climbed into my faded pickup truck and merged onto the desolate industrial highway leading back toward the city limits. My eyes instinctively flicked to the rearview mirror, a habit ingrained from decades of operating in the shadows of high-stakes transportation. 2 cars back, a dull gray sedan maintained a rigid, unvarying distance. When I changed lanes, the sedan perfectly mirrored my movement. When I slowed down to test the flow of traffic, the driver immediately tapped his brakes awkwardly, attempting to blend in with the surrounding vehicles. Bradley had apparently scrounged up enough loose cash to hire a low-level private investigator. This amateur operative was clearly tasked with mapping my daily routine, tracking my movements, and desperately searching for any exploitable blind spots in my schedule or my security protocols around Warehouse 7. The sheer audacity of the tactic was almost laughable. Bradley actually thought a cheap suburban sleuth could outmaneuver a man who designed transport security grids for federal contractors. I kept my speed completely steady, deciding to let this amateur play his little game just long enough to reel him in. I have survived 30 grueling years navigating the brutal, cutthroat world of international corporate espionage and cartel interference. I have evaded highly trained surveillance teams in foreign territories and dismantled complex infiltration attempts orchestrated by phantom organizations with bottomless budgets. Being tailed by a rookie in a generic rental car was not a threat to my operation. It was a profound personal insult. I did not speed up or attempt any evasive driving maneuvers. Instead, I signaled calmly and guided my pickup truck off the main highway, taking a series of winding, isolated service roads that led deep into the abandoned outskirts of the warehouse district. I pulled into the cracked, weed-choked parking lot of a deserted, neon-lit diner that had permanently closed its doors a decade ago. The gray sedan followed blindly, pulling to a hesitant stop near the edge of the broken asphalt, trying to hide behind a rusted dumpster. The driver killed his headlights, foolishly believing the shadows provided adequate cover. I turned off my engine, opened the heavy door of my truck, and walked with deliberate, measured steps directly across the empty lot. The driver was so intensely focused on adjusting a cheap digital camera on his steering wheel that he failed to notice my approach until my shadow fell completely over his windshield. I did not yell or draw a weapon. I simply raised my hand and tapped my knuckles sharply against the driver's side window. The man inside jumped violently, dropping his camera onto the floorboard. He stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, looking exactly like a child caught stealing candy. I gestured calmly for him to unlock the doors, projecting an aura of absolute, undeniable authority that left him entirely paralyzed with fear. The mechanical lock clicked open with a loud, distinct snap. I opened the passenger door and slid smoothly into the cheap fabric seat, invading his isolated sanctuary. The private investigator was a young, sweating man reeking of cheap coffee and mounting panic. He pressed his back hard against his door, stuttering pathetic, transparent lies about being lost and looking for highway directions. I did not let him finish a single fabricated sentence. I reached inside my heavy corduroy jacket and pulled out a thick, banded stack of crisp $100 bills. I tossed the heavy bundle casually onto the dusty dashboard. The money landed with a solid thud, instantly silencing his frantic stammering. I spoke in a low, even tone, informing him that the cash sitting inches from his face easily tripled whatever pathetic daily rate Bradley was paying him for this amateur surveillance operation. I explained with freezing clarity that he had just stumbled blindly into a high-stakes corporate war that was entirely out of his depth. I offered him a very simple, non-negotiable transaction. He could take the money, walk away from this job without a single broken bone, and entirely forget my face. In exchange, he would immediately grant me complete, unrestricted access to every single piece of digital communication he had shared with my son-in-law. The young man stared at the thick stack of cash, his throat bobbing nervously as he swallowed his pride and his professional ethics. He was an amateur looking for a quick paycheck, not a hardened soldier willing to die for a client who forged mortgages. He slowly nodded his head, reaching out with a trembling hand to secure the money. He had chosen the path of least resistance, precisely as I had calculated. The terrified investigator reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his unlocked smartphone, and handed it directly to me without uttering a single word of protest. I grabbed the device and immediately opened the encrypted messaging application he was using to communicate with his employer. The digital conversation log laid out Bradley's entire desperate timeline in perfect chronological order. I scrolled past the mundane updates regarding my driving routes and daily coffee habits, hunting for the critical tactical data. I found it buried in a rapid, frantic exchange of messages sent just hours after my confrontation in the driveway. Bradley had officially finalized his deadly arrangement with the loan sharks. He had sent an explicit, detailed message promising the Volkov Syndicate full unhindered access to the loading bays of Warehouse 7 precisely at midnight this coming Friday. The text messages outlined a complete operational blueprint. Bradley intended to personally disable the primary security alarms, open the heavy, reinforced gates, and guide the armed syndicate enforcers directly to the specific crates labeled as industrial platinum. He was using the phantom $23 million cargo as a direct physical trade to erase his massive debt and save his own life. He genuinely believed that the facility would be completely empty, guarded by nothing more than automated cameras and rusty padlocks. He was entirely convinced that sacrificing my logistics company was a brilliant, victimless crime. I handed the phone back to the sweating operative and stepped out of the vehicle into the cold night air. I watched the gray sedan speed frantically out of the abandoned parking lot, leaving me completely alone in the darkness. Bradley had officially crossed the point of no return. Friday night was rapidly approaching, and I needed to prepare a devastating reception for his new criminal partners. Friday morning broke with a heavy, overcast sky that cast long, gray shadows across my quiet suburban street. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, completely prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The sharp, rapid knocking at my front door echoed through the silent house precisely at 8 o'clock. I stood up, smoothed the front of my faded corduroy jacket, and walked deliberately down the hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open. Bradley stood on my front porch wearing a crisp tailored suit and a highly rehearsed, entirely fraudulent expression of deep contrition. He immediately launched into a sickeningly sweet monologue, loudly proclaiming his sudden desire to apologize for his completely unacceptable behavior at the dinner party. He claimed the stress of his massive technological ventures had temporarily overwhelmed his better judgment. I did not invite him inside. I simply stared at his face, waiting for the true purpose of his visit to materialize. Bradley shifted his weight nervously and stepped aside, gesturing toward the edge of my driveway. He was not alone. The same two massive, broad-shouldered men from the black SUV stepped out of the morning fog and walked aggressively up my concrete path. They wore dark tactical jackets over thick turtlenecks, their eyes hidden behind polarized sunglasses. Bradley cleared his throat, his arrogant smirk flickering briefly across his face as he introduced the towering thugs. He casually referred to them as his primary venture capital investors and essential business partners who were visiting from the East Coast. He insisted they needed to discuss a highly lucrative, mutually beneficial arrangement regarding my storage facilities. The charade was incredibly thin, but the imminent physical threat standing on my welcome mat was absolutely real. The two enforcers did not wait for an invitation. The larger man stepped aggressively forward, using his massive physical bulk to force the front door completely open. He shoved past my shoulder, driving me backward into the hallway, while Bradley followed closely behind, shutting the door firmly against the outside world. The thugs marched directly into my modest living room and dropped their heavy frames onto my worn, floral-patterned couch. They sat with their legs spread wide, actively claiming ownership of the space, while Bradley remained standing in the center of the room. He shoved his hands deep into his tailored pockets and adopted a sickeningly patronizing tone, speaking to me as if I were a slow-witted child. He dramatically praised my years of hard work, sweeping dusty floors and polishing rusty padlocks, framing my entire existence as a quaint, insignificant struggle. He then reached inside his jacket and produced a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. He tossed the money casually onto my worn armchair, proudly announcing that it was exactly $10,000 in untraceable cash. Bradley framed the bribe as a generous, life-changing charitable donation from his wealthy associates. In exchange for this overwhelming financial gift, he simply required the physical master keys and the primary access code specifically for Warehouse 7. He spun a rapid, slick lie about expecting a massive shipment of highly sensitive proprietary tech equipment arriving late that night. He claimed his regular facilities were completely overbooked and he desperately needed secure temporary storage for the weekend. He smiled broadly, insisting that this incredibly generous arrangement was the perfect opportunity for me to finally retire and stop working like a common laborer. He stood there practically glowing with arrogance, entirely convinced I would blindly swallow his ridiculous fabrication. I ignored the stack of money completely and shifted my focus to the two syndicate soldiers occupying my couch. They were staring at me with cold, dead eyes, their posture radiating silent, escalating hostility. The man seated on the left casually unbuttoned his dark tactical jacket and leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees. The deliberate movement caused his coat to fall open explicitly, revealing the dull black steel of a heavy-caliber semi-automatic pistol resting in a leather shoulder holster. His partner mirrored the exact same motion, subtly shifting his massive shoulders to display his own concealed weapon. The gesture was not an accident or a careless oversight. It was a highly choreographed, explicitly threatening display of lethal force designed to shatter the psychological resolve of a civilian target. I did not flinch, gasp, or break eye contact with the armed intruders. I recognized this specific brand of brutal intimidation immediately. Long before I commanded a multi-million-dollar corporate infrastructure, I built the foundational roots of my logistics empire from the ground up in the most violent, unforgiving industrial neighborhoods in the country. During those grueling early years, ruthless local enforcers and organized protection rackets constantly attempted to extort my fledgling operation. I survived that brutal environment by learning to read the precise mechanics of violence and neutralizing threats before they could strike. I knew exactly how these syndicate thugs operated. They relied entirely on the paralyzing effect of sudden, overwhelming terror to extract compliance from their victims. They expected the frail old janitor to drop to his knees and surrender his keys the moment he saw the guns. They fundamentally failed to understand that the unassuming man standing quietly in his living room was the most dangerous apex predator in the entire house. I looked directly at Bradley and flatly rejected his offer, stating in a calm, unwavering voice that my storage facilities were entirely booked and off-limits to unverified commercial cargo. Bradley's patronizing smile vanished instantly, replaced by a twitching, deeply volatile fury. Before he could speak, the larger enforcer sitting on my couch suddenly stood up. He did not draw his firearm. Instead, he reached behind his back, produced a massive serrated hunting knife, and drove the heavy steel blade downward with terrifying, explosive violence. The thick blade slammed directly into the center of my antique wooden coffee table, splintering the polished oak with a deafening crack. The enforcer left the knife embedded deep in the wood, leaning his massive weight over the table to glare down at me with pure, unfiltered malice. Bradley stepped out from behind his armed muscle, his confidence entirely restored by the brutal display of sudden destruction. He smiled coldly, his eyes completely devoid of any remaining humanity. He stopped pretending to be an entrepreneurial visionary and fully embraced his role as a cornered, desperate criminal. He explicitly demanded the master keys to Warehouse 7, dropping the thin facade of temporary tech storage completely. Bradley lowered his voice to a menacing whisper and pointed toward the knife buried in my table. He reminded me with chilling casualty that tragic, fatal accidents happen to lonely, stubborn old men every single day in this city. He outlined exactly how easily an unfortunate fall down a flight of stairs or a sudden violent home invasion could permanently solve his logistical problem. He issued a final absolute ultimatum, ordering me to hand over the keys immediately or face the lethal, unavoidable consequences of defying the men standing in my living room. I stared at the serrated hunting knife vibrating in the center of my antique coffee table, allowing the absolute silence of the room to stretch. I deliberately released the tension in my shoulders, letting my posture physically collapse inward. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, perfectly mimicking the panicked hyperventilation of a frail, terrified senior citizen who had just broken under the overwhelming pressure of a violent home invasion. I let a visible tremor travel down my arms, ensuring Bradley and his armed syndicates saw exactly what they desperately wanted to see. I broke eye contact, lowering my gaze to the floor in a universal gesture of total submission. I raised my hands in a pathetic, shaking gesture of surrender, silently communicating that their brutal intimidation tactic had succeeded flawlessly. I shuffled slowly toward the heavy oak desk in the corner of my living room, dragging my feet slightly across the carpet to sell the illusion of sudden, paralyzing age. Every step was a carefully calculated performance. I had spent decades sitting across from ruthless negotiators, hostile corporate raiders, and desperate men who mistook volume for actual power. I knew precisely how to feed a predator's ego until they blinded themselves to the trap closing around their ankles. Bradley watched my slow, pathetic retreat with a sickening expression of supreme victory. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, entirely convinced his aggressive mastery of the situation had finally put the worthless old janitor in his proper place. He believed he had broken my spirit through sheer terror. He did not realize I was simply giving him the precise amount of rope he required to hang himself. My trembling hands reached for the polished brass handle of the top drawer. I pulled the heavy oak drawer open, ensuring the wooden runners scraped loudly in the quiet room. My fingers brushed past stacks of mundane household bills and useless receipts, intentionally fumbling in the dark space to amplify my performance of total panic. I grasped a cold, heavy steel keyring resting exactly where I had deliberately placed it hours earlier. Attached to the thick metal ring were two sleek, bright red electronic keycards. They were entirely distinct from the standard gray access badges used by the civilian dock workers during normal operating hours. I pulled the heavy ring from the drawer and turned back to face the men occupying my living room. I clutched the red cards against my chest for a brief second, executing a final pathetic display of hesitation, before slowly extending my shaking hand toward my son-in-law. Bradley did not walk forward to accept the surrender. He snapped his fingers and pointed at the floor, demanding I cross the room and deliver the access codes directly to him. I shuffled forward, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on my worn boots. I extended my trembling arm and offered up the heavy steel ring. The red plastic cards caught the dim living room light, practically glowing against the dull fabric of my faded corduroy jacket. I looked up at Bradley with wide, defeated eyes, perfectly executing the expression of a completely broken man handing over the final shreds of his personal dignity. I told him in a quiet, broken whisper that these specific cards would grant him complete access to the primary loading bays of Warehouse 7. I begged him not to let his violent associates destroy the facility. I pleaded with him to simply take what he needed and leave my daughter entirely out of his lethal mess. Bradley snatched the heavy steel ring from my trembling fingers with aggressive, triumphant force. He did not bother to examine the bright red plastic or question why the primary access keys to a massive commercial storage facility looked entirely different from standard corporate security badges. His overwhelming arrogance and sheer desperation rendered him completely blind to minor operational details. I specifically chose those two red keycards for this exact encounter. When I secured the highly classified Department of Defense logistics contracts a decade ago, I personally engineered a multi-layered, fail-deadly security grid for our most sensitive transit hubs. Warehouse 7 was not a simple holding pen for industrial metals. It functioned as an active, dark site transfer station for seized international contraband and classified military-grade weaponry. The standard gray badges deactivated the civilian alarms during regular daytime shifts. The red badges, however, were specifically coded emergency bypass modules. I knew precisely what silent, devastating protocol those red cards initiated when swiped against the perimeter access scanners anytime after midnight. They do not unlock the doors or disable the internal motion sensors. They instantly confirm an active hostile breach of a federal installation. The system immediately initiates a complete electromagnetic lockdown, dropping heavy armor plates over every single exit and trapping the intruders inside a reinforced concrete vault. Simultaneously, the red cards silently broadcast a Level 4 Homeland Security crisis alert directly to the regional federal tactical response teams stationed less than 5 miles away. Bradley thought he was securing a quiet, unhindered path to $23 million in stolen industrial platinum. He was actually holding a direct, unblockable beacon that would summon the full, devastating weight of the United States federal government directly down upon his head the second he used them. Bradley flipped the heavy steel ring around his index finger, laughing out loud at my pathetic display of submission. He sneered at my worn face, mocking my cowardice and openly ridiculing the decades I spent building what he believed was a worthless, low-level, blue-collar business. He adjusted his expensive designer suit and instructed his 2 armed syndicates to head back to their vehicle. Bradley told me to lock my doors, stay quiet, and pray that his late-night cargo transfer went smoothly. He turned his back on me with absolute dismissive arrogance and walked confidently out of my house, flanked by his towering enforcers. The heavy front door slammed shut, the deadbolt clicking sharply in the quiet hallway. I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, listening to the heavy engine of their black SUV roar to life and speed away down the suburban street. The exact millisecond the sound of their tires faded into the distance, my violent physical trembling ceased entirely. My hunched spine snapped straight. The terrified, broken expression vanished from my face, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a man actively directing a war. I reached into my jacket pocket, entirely ignoring the $10,000 in bribe money scattered across my armchair, and pulled out a heavy encrypted burner phone. I punched in a restricted 12-digit federal number. The line connected immediately without a single ring. I pressed the dark plastic receiver against my ear. "Agent Thorne," I said, my voice echoing with absolute freezing authority in the empty house. "The bait has been taken without any hesitation. The target possesses the red access credentials and is highly motivated. Secure the external perimeter immediately and prepare your assault teams for a midnight breach. I drove my faded pickup truck away from my neighborhood, leaving Bradley and his armed shadows completely behind. I could not allow my daughter to spend another single second inside that house with a desperate, cornered criminal. Bradley had just initiated a sequence of events that would end in massive federal retaliation, and the Volkov syndicate would inevitably seek collateral if his promised delivery failed. Kendra was standing directly on ground zero. I pulled into the crowded parking lot of Oak Ridge High School, ignoring the visitor parking spaces and leaving my truck idling aggressively in the fire lane directly outside the main administrative doors. I walked through the double glass doors with a rapid, unyielding stride, entirely bypassing the startled receptionist at the front desk. I knew Kendra's schedule perfectly. I marched straight down the polished linoleum hallway toward the primary conference room. Through the narrow glass pane in the door, I saw her leading a faculty meeting, standing confidently before a dozen teachers. I pushed the heavy door open, ignoring the sudden silence that swept across the room. I did not offer a polite apology or fabricate a convenient family emergency. I looked directly into Kendra's eyes and stated in a tone of absolute unbreakable authority that she needed to step away from the podium and come with me immediately. My daughter recognized the severe, unyielding look on my face instantly. It was the same look I wore decades ago when I protected our family from neighborhood threats. She did not argue or ask a single question in front of her staff. She simply set down her marker, grabbed her purse, and followed me out of the building. I escorted her straight to my idling truck and instructed her to get inside. The heavy steel door of the pickup truck slammed shut, sealing us inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin. I did not start the engine or attempt to soften the blow with comforting parental platitudes. Time was a luxury we completely lacked. I reached into the back seat and retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder assembled by my corporate security division. I placed the dense file directly onto Kendra's lap. I instructed her to open it and examine the contents carefully, warning her that her entire reality was about to change. With hesitant fingers, she flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. The first document she encountered was a high-resolution, pixel-perfect printout of the $400,000 second mortgage placed on her home. I pointed to the signature line, explaining with clinical detachment exactly how Bradley had digitally forged her name using scraped metadata. Before she could voice her initial shock, I flipped to the next page. I forced her to look at the meticulously compiled ledgers detailing Bradley's catastrophic offshore gambling debts. The numbers were staggering, reflecting years of pathological financial ruin hidden behind a facade of Silicon Valley entrepreneurship. The final devastating blow lay in the glossy surveillance photographs resting at the bottom of the stack. The high-definition images clearly depicted Bradley standing in dimly lit alleyways and expensive underground clubs, nervously shaking hands with heavily armed enforcers. I identified the men in the photographs for her explicitly naming the Volkov syndicate. I explained the brutal, unforgiving nature of the organization holding her husband's massive debt. I watched her eyes dart across the undeniable physical evidence, processing the terrifying reality that the man sleeping in her bed was a desperate fraud who had traded her financial security to appease violent loan sharks. Kendra stared down at the damning paperwork resting heavily on her lap. I expected tears, panic, or a frantic, desperate attempt to defend the man she had loved for the past 4 years. Instead, a profound, eerie stillness settled over her. The initial shock of the betrayal evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. She possessed the exact same analytical mind and unbreakable resilience that had allowed me to survive and conquer the brutal logistics industry. During her youth, before she dedicated her life to education, she had watched me dismantle aggressive corporate rivals by stripping away their emotional leverage and focusing entirely on the raw data. She was actively applying that exact same methodology right now. She did not mourn the sudden death of her marriage. She systematically reviewed the mortgage timestamps, the gambling losses, and the dates printed on the syndicate surveillance photos. The pieces of the puzzle snapped violently into place. She realized with chilling precision that Bradley's constant business trips, his sudden demands for joint account access, and his aggressive belittlement of my humble lifestyle were all calculated components of a long-term financial con. He had never viewed her as an equal partner. He had targeted her stability, isolated her from her fiercely protective father by mocking my perceived lower-class status, and systematically drained her resources to fund his pathological addictions. The loving, supportive husband was an intricate illusion designed to keep her entirely pacified while he dismantled her life piece by piece. Kendra closed the thick manila folder and looked up at me. Her expression was completely devoid of sorrow. Her eyes hardened into sharp, focused points of cold steel, radiating an intense, quiet fury that perfectly mirrored my own. She was ready to strike back. The heavy silence inside the truck cabin was abruptly shattered by a sharp, aggressive chime radiating from Kendra's purse. She reached inside and pulled out her smartphone. The screen illuminated brightly, displaying a severe automated red alert sent directly from her primary banking institution. She opened the secure application, her eyes scanning the digital notification with rapid intensity. The color drained from her face a second time, but this time it was fueled by pure, unadulterated anger. She turned the screen toward me so I could read the incoming data. Bradley had just executed a massive sweeping electronic transfer. He had violently liquidated her entire personal checking account, completely emptied her emergency savings, and maxed out the cash advance limits on her remaining credit lines. The digital balances on her screen all read 0. My security software immediately pinged my encrypted burner phone with a secondary, deeply sinister piece of intelligence. I cross-referenced the financial drain with Bradley's active digital footprint. The stolen funds were not being routed to the Volkov syndicate to clear his fatal debt. He had just used Kendra's final dollars to purchase a highly expedited, untraceable one-way international flight to Eastern Europe scheduled for departure exactly at midnight. The sheer cowardice of his strategy crystallized instantly. Bradley had absolutely no intention of facing the federal authorities or the violent loan sharks. He intended to use my stolen red keycards to point the syndicate toward the warehouse, creating a massive tactical diversion. While the federal strike team annihilated his criminal partners, he planned to be 30,000 feet in the air, leaving his bankrupt, oblivious wife behind to face the devastating fallout and the remaining syndicate members completely alone. The trap was set, but the prey was attempting to run. I navigated my heavy truck away from the suburban sprawl and merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the bustling heart of the city's financial district. I could not risk taking my daughter anywhere associated with her past life or my known public addresses. I pulled into the subterranean parking garage of the Grand Continental, a luxury hotel that privately catered to high-profile executives and visiting dignitaries requiring absolute discretion. I bypassed the main lobby, entirely escorting Kendra up a restricted service elevator using an executive bypass key I kept strictly for emergencies. I secured the penthouse suite occupying the entire top floor, ensuring the room possessed reinforced steel doors, impact-resistant glass, and 0 adjacent balconies. The moment we stepped inside the sprawling, immaculate suite, I made a single encrypted phone call. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 of my most experienced, heavily armed private security contractors arrived silently in the hallway outside. They were men I had personally vetted from elite military units, fiercely loyal and completely lethal. I introduced them briefly to Kendra, instructing them to maintain a strict, unyielding perimeter around the suite and authorizing deadly force against anyone attempting unauthorized entry. Kendra stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering city skyline, still processing the monumental collapse of her reality. I walked over and placed my hands firmly on her shoulders, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. I made her an absolute, unbreakable promise. I swore on my life that Bradley would never come near her again, and that the men he had partnered with would be entirely eradicated before the sun came up. I told her to lock the heavy door, trust the guards, and wait for my return. Leaving the hotel, I drove my faded pickup truck back toward the heavy industrial district, pushing the engine hard through the deteriorating weather. A cold, driving rain had begun to fall, slicking the empty highways and casting distorted reflections across the asphalt. I did not drive directly to the primary gates of Sector 4 logistics. Instead, I diverted my route down a forgotten, unpaved access road, hidden completely behind a thick line of overgrown industrial pines exactly 2 miles out from the main compound. The road terminated in a muddy clearing occupied by a massive, completely unmarked matte black tractor trailer. To a passing observer, it looked like an abandoned piece of commercial freight left to rust in the weeds. In reality, it was a state-of-the-art, heavily armored mobile command center, retrofitted to withstand ballistic assaults and electronic warfare. I parked my truck deep in the shadows and walked up to the reinforced steel side door. An optical scanner instantly verified my biometric signature, unlocking the heavy hydraulic latches with a sharp hiss of pressurized air. I stepped out of the freezing rain and into the hyper-focused, climate-controlled environment of the mobile command hub. The interior was a narrow corridor, lined entirely with glowing surveillance monitors, encrypted communication relays, and high-definition thermal imaging feeds. The air hummed with the quiet, intense energy of high-level tactical operations. A dozen elite federal operatives dressed in dark, unmarked tactical gear moved with precise, coordinated efficiency, adjusting satellite uplinks and verifying perimeter sensor arrays. The atmosphere was completely devoid of panic or chaos. Every single person inside the trailer was a seasoned professional preparing to execute a lethal, highly choreographed ambush. I stripped off my wet corduroy jacket and walked directly toward the primary observation console dominating the front of the room. A tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark tactical vest over a black long-sleeved shirt turned away from the primary monitors as I approached. Agent Thorne was a seasoned veteran of federal counterterrorism operations, and he greeted me not as a civilian informant, but with the strict, unwavering professional respect reserved for a high-ranking commanding officer. We had successfully executed dozens of classified operations together over the past decade. Bradley and his syndicate handlers genuinely believed they were targeting a vulnerable, poorly managed commercial storage unit holding crates of industrial platinum. They were entirely oblivious to the true nature of my corporate empire. Sector 4 Logistics was not a civilian freight company. We were a highly classified, heavily vetted government contractor. We possessed the exclusive top-tier federal contracts responsible for the secure transportation and temporary storage of seized international contraband, illicit narcotics, and highly sensitive military-grade weaponry bound for destruction. Warehouse 7 was specifically designed as a dark site transit hub for the Department of Defense. It was engineered to appear vulnerable from the outside while functioning as an impenetrable, heavily weaponized trap on the inside. Thorne handed me a steaming cup of black coffee and provided a rapid clinical situational report. His heavily armed assault teams were already positioned in the shadows surrounding the warehouse, rendering the entire facility a lethal kill zone. Snipers occupied the high ground on the adjacent industrial rooftops, and armored interception vehicles were idling silently out of sight, ready to blockade the access roads. We had completely militarized the entire industrial park. Bradley had inadvertently sold the Volkov Syndicate a direct ticket to a federal slaughterhouse, and I was going to ensure every single one of those violent parasites walked right into the meat grinder. Thorne and I stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim blue light of the command center, our eyes locked onto the glowing high-definition monitors displaying the live infrared feeds from the perimeter cameras. The digital clock in the corner of the screen relentlessly ticked closer to midnight. The torrential rain continued to hammer the concrete outside, degrading visibility and masking the ambient sounds of the city. Right on Schedule 3, heavy black utility vans materialized from the thick curtain of rain. They rolled slowly down the main access road with their headlights completely extinguished, operating under the cover of total darkness. The convoy crept forward with predatory caution, bypassing the automated civilian checkpoints and pulling to a slow, silent stop directly in front of the massive electrified steel barricades of Warehouse 7. The heavy side door of the lead van slid open, and Bradley stepped out onto the rain-slicked pavement. He pulled the collar of his expensive suit jacket up against the freezing downpour, looking nervously over his shoulder at the armed enforcers waiting inside the vehicles. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out the heavy steel ring I had surrendered to him earlier that morning. The bright red electronic keycard stood out vividly against the bleak, gray background of the security footage. Bradley took a deep, steadying breath, clearly trying to project an air of confident mastery to his new criminal partners. He walked up to the reinforced digital access panel mounted on the concrete pillar and swiped the red card directly across the optical scanner. A faint green confirmation light blinked on the panel. The massive hydraulic locks disengaged with a loud mechanical groan, and the heavy steel gates swung open effortlessly, inviting the syndicate directly into the dark, waiting abyss. The heavy steel gates ground to a halt with a resonant metallic thud that echoed into the rainy night. Bradley stepped through the threshold, his chest puffed out with a false sense of absolute invincibility. He gestured sharply, signaling the dozen heavily armed Volkov Syndicate operatives waiting in the idling vans to follow him inside. The men poured onto the massive concrete loading bay, their tactical boots splashing through the puddles that had formed near the entrance. They moved with aggressive, predatory confidence, fanning out across the expansive warehouse floor with their automatic rifles drawn and sweeping the dark corners. Bradley walked at the center of the formation, clutching the red electronic keycard like a sacred talisman. He genuinely believed that the small piece of plastic had entirely neutralized the complex internal security grids protecting Sector 4 logistics. He pointed toward the sprawling rows of towering storage racks, instructing the syndicate muscle to bypass the administrative offices and head directly for the high-value cargo sectors deep within the facility. The vast cavernous space was eerily silent save for the rhythmic drumming of the torrential rain hammering against the corrugated steel roof. The automated lighting system hummed to life as they crossed the primary threshold, casting long, harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Bradley mistook the sudden illumination for a welcoming embrace, entirely convinced that his stolen credentials had granted him complete, undisputed ownership of the fortress. He strutted past the rows of inactive forklifts and dormant conveyor belts, his mind already calculating the massive payout he was about to secure. He had no idea that the oppressive silence of the warehouse was not the sound of an empty, vulnerable facility, but rather the breathless anticipation of a perfectly executed trap waiting to snap shut. The armed syndicate members navigated the labyrinth of towering steel racks, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom until they reached the designated high-security storage sector. Sitting in the very center of the reinforced concrete bay was a cluster of enormous, heavily banded wooden shipping crates. Stenciled across the side of each massive wooden box in stark black military-grade lettering were the exact serial numbers Bradley had desperately memorized from the outdated transit manifest. Beneath the numerical codes, the words "Industrial Platinum" were clearly printed, verifying the incredible value of the cargo. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks, a wide, sickening smile of absolute triumph spreading across his sweating face. The crushing weight of his lethal debt and the terrifying reality of his impending assassination completely evaporated from his mind. He genuinely believed he had just secured his permanent freedom and a life-changing fortune in one fell swoop. He turned to the hulking syndicate lieutenant standing beside him and proudly slapped his shoulder, declaring that his end of the bargain was officially fulfilled. The lieutenant merely grunted, his eyes fixed hungrily on the wooden containers. Bradley stepped back and eagerly directed the armed men to break the seals. 4 of the largest operatives stepped forward, holstering their weapons and pulling heavy steel crowbars from their tactical harnesses. They jammed the pry bars beneath the thick wooden lids, the sound of splintering timber and snapping industrial nails echoing sharply through the cavernous warehouse. Bradley stood on the tips of his toes, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. He envisioned bars of gleaming raw platinum reflecting the harsh overhead lights, perfectly picturing the endless wealth that would finally validate his entire fraudulent existence and permanently silence the father-in-law who had constantly doubted his brilliance. 2 miles away, inside the climate-controlled silence of the mobile command center, I watched the live, high-definition surveillance feed with absolute clinical detachment. Agent Thorne stood rigidly beside me, his arms crossed over his tactical vest, his eyes locked onto the glowing monitors tracking every single movement the syndicate made. Bradley was celebrating a phantom victory, completely unaware of the lethal digital tripwire he had willingly triggered. I had explicitly engineered the security architecture of Warehouse 7 to exploit the exact brand of arrogant stupidity Bradley was currently displaying. The red keycard he clutched so proudly was never designed to deactivate the internal defense grids. During the facility's initial construction phase, the Department of Defense required an immediate fail-safe countermeasure against hostile armed incursions. The red badge was a specialized duress credential issued only to top-tier federal transport directors. When swiped against an external perimeter scanner after midnight, it bypassed the standard commercial alarms entirely to prevent the intruders from realizing they had been detected. Instead, it executed a silent, instantaneous protocol transmitting a Level 4 Homeland Security breach code directly to the local federal field office. The moment that green confirmation light had blinked on the access panel, Bradley had unknowingly classified himself and his armed companions as domestic terrorists attacking a fortified government installation. He had locked the heavy blast doors behind him and thrown away the key. Thorne tapped his earpiece, listening intently to the encrypted tactical radio chatter. He turned to me and confirmed that the perimeter was completely sealed. Armored interception units had silently barricaded every possible exit route, and the assault teams were stacked tight outside the loading bay doors. The trap had closed flawlessly, catching the rats exactly where we wanted them. Inside the warehouse, the brutal sound of tearing wood reached a crescendo as the syndicate operatives simultaneously wrenched the heavy lids off the primary shipping crates. Bradley surged forward, pushing past the armed men to claim his prize, his hands trembling with unadulterated greed. He leaned over the splintered edge of the massive container, entirely expecting to see stacks of heavy, glittering platinum bars. Instead, the harsh overhead lighting illuminated a reality that instantly shattered his triumphant illusion. There were no precious metals hidden inside the reinforced wooden walls. The crates were packed tightly with impact-resistant molded foam, perfectly cradling rows of sleek, matte black, highly classified military-grade drone technology. The aerodynamic fuselages and complex targeting optics reflected a cold, deadly purpose that had absolutely nothing to do with commercial salvage. Bradley stared down at the sophisticated weaponry in utter paralyzing confusion. The greedy smile slid off his face, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of sheer terror as his analytical mind desperately tried to comprehend the monumental scale of his miscalculation. The outdated transit manifest he had stolen was completely obsolete, a discarded piece of misdirection meant for a bygone era. He slowly lifted his head, making eye contact with the syndicate lieutenant. The massive enforcer was no longer looking at the cargo with hungry anticipation. He was staring directly at Bradley with a look of pure, murderous realization. The loan sharks instantly understood that they had not been led to a lucrative heist. They had been lured into a highly illegal federal weapons cache. The oppressive silence of the warehouse was abruptly shattered by the deafening mechanical roar of the primary blast doors sealing shut, instantly plunging the entire syndicate into an inescapable steel cage. The syndicate lieutenant's eyes darted frantically from the sleek military-grade drone technology to Bradley's terrified face. The realization hit the hardened criminal veteran instantly. This was not a commercial salvage operation holding loose industrial metals. This was a highly classified Department of Defense armory. Without a single second of hesitation, the massive enforcer lunged forward with explosive speed. His thick hands wrapped violently around Bradley's throat, lifting him completely off the concrete floor. The lieutenant drove Bradley backward with the brutal force of a battering ram, slamming his spine aggressively against the heavy iron mast of a nearby inactive forklift. The immense impact knocked the wind entirely from Bradley's lungs, leaving him gasping and clawing at the thick fingers crushing his windpipe. The lieutenant pressed his face inches from Bradley's sweating forehead, his voice a low, lethal growl echoing over the sound of the sealing doors. He explicitly accused Bradley of orchestrating a deliberate federal sting operation designed to wipe out the Volkov syndicate. The other heavily armed operatives immediately raised their automatic rifles, completely abandoning the wooden crates and leveling their weapons directly at Bradley's chest. They operated purely on survival instinct, assuming their supposed corporate inside man was actually a confidential informant working for the government. Bradley kicked his legs helplessly, his expensive designer suit tearing against the sharp industrial machinery. He tried frantically to form words desperate to explain the stolen transit manifest and the colossal misunderstanding, but the lieutenant simply tightened his lethal grip. The criminal boss explicitly detailed exactly how he was going to execute Bradley the very second they found a way out of this facility. Bradley realized with absolute, suffocating clarity that even if he somehow survived, the federal authorities waiting outside the violent men trapped inside the warehouse with him would never let him live. Before Bradley could force a single syllable of defense through his crushed windpipe, the primary steel loading bay doors completed their descent with a deafening, apocalyptic metallic crash. The sheer kinetic force of the massive steel plates striking the concrete foundation sent a violent tremor vibrating through the soles of their tactical boots. It was the absolute unmistakable sound of a permanent, unyielding seal. The syndicate enforcers whipped their heads toward the loading bay entrance, their operational training immediately assessing the structural integrity of their new prison. The gates were not standard commercial roll-up doors constructed of flimsy aluminum. They were foot-thick slabs of reinforced ballistic steel designed specifically to withstand high-yield explosive breaching charges. Bradley watched the heavy internal deadbolts engage with a rapid series of loud mechanical slams, locking them completely inside the belly of the fortress. He saw absolute, unfiltered panic flicker across the faces of the hardened criminals surrounding him. The lieutenant finally released his crushing grip, dropping Bradley like a discarded rag doll onto the cold concrete floor. Bradley fell to his hands and knees, coughing violently and gasping for oxygen as the crushing reality of his total failure washed over him. He stared at the impenetrable steel wall blocking his only exit. He had foolishly believed he was outsmarting a frail old man manipulating a lonely senior citizen for a quick financial payout. Instead, he had walked blindly into an intricately engineered trap that I had laid out for him with mathematical precision. He realized the electronic keys he aggressively demanded the security grid he thought he bypassed, and the entire storage facility itself were highly weaponized instruments of his own destruction. The syndicate operatives rushed the loading bay doors, slamming their fists against the cold steel, searching desperately for a manual override that simply did not exist. The massive warehouse instantly transitioned into absolute total lockdown mode. Deep within the reinforced concrete walls, heavy electromagnetic locks engaged with a synchronized heavy thud, permanently sealing every secondary exit ventilation shaft and subterranean maintenance corridor. The blinding overhead commercial halogens abruptly cut out, plunging the massive cavernous space into complete suffocating darkness for a fraction of a second. Then rows of intense flashing red emergency strobes ignited along the ceiling, bathing the towering steel racks and the terrified syndicate operatives in a harsh, disorienting crimson glow. The strobing lights cast long, frantic shadows across the concrete floor, maximizing the psychological pressure on the trapped intruders. I had personally engineered this exact environmental response protocol decades ago, shortly after securing my first classified federal transport contract. During those volatile early years building my empire, rival logistics firms frequently hired mercenary crews to raid our storage hubs and cripple our supply lines. I quickly realized that traditional civilian security measures only delayed heavily armed attackers. I needed a system that actively disoriented and neutralized them before they could secure our cargo. The flashing red strobes were specifically calibrated to induce severe vertigo and shatter tactical coordination, transforming highly trained assault teams into panicked, disorganized targets. The Volkov operatives reacted exactly as I had calculated. They stumbled backward, shielding their eyes from the aggressive crimson glare, their automatic weapons tracking wildly into the dark, empty corners of the warehouse. The lieutenant barked frantic, chaotic orders, demanding his men form a tight defensive perimeter around the military drones, but the strobing lights completely obliterated their unit cohesion. Bradley remained paralyzed on the floor, weeping openly as the harsh red light washed over his tear-stained face. He was entirely broken, trapped inside a sensory deprivation nightmare that I designed explicitly for men who dared to threaten my family. The chaotic shouting of the syndicate operatives was suddenly drowned out by a booming, digitally synthesized voice erupting from the high-fidelity public address speakers mounted high on the warehouse walls. The audio feed was crisp, overwhelmingly loud, and completely devoid of human emotion. It was not the hesitant, rehearsed warning of a private corporate security guard asking unauthorized trespassers to politely vacate the premises. It was the hardened, authoritative command of a federal tactical commander broadcasting directly from the armored mobile unit stationed exactly 2 miles away. The voice identified itself as the primary assault leader for the Federal Bureau of Investigation hostage rescue team. The commander officially informed the men trapped inside the building that they had illegally breached a classified Department of Defense installation and were currently surrounded by heavily armed federal operatives. The booming voice clinically detailed the exact number of snipers holding lethal overwatch positions on the adjacent industrial rooftops and the armored interception vehicles currently blocking every conceivable escape route. The tactical commander issued a final absolute directive. He ordered all individuals to immediately drop their weapons, place their hands flat on the back of their heads, and step entirely away from the military hardware or face immediate, overwhelming, lethal force. The syndicate operatives froze completely, their automatic rifles suddenly feeling like heavy, useless blocks of lead in their hands. They looked at their lieutenant, waiting for a suicidal order to fight their way out. But the criminal boss simply lowered his weapon, realizing the absolute futility of engaging a dedicated federal strike team in a locked vault. Bradley pressed his face flat against the cold concrete floor, covering his ears, as the synthesized voice repeated the final warning. He finally understood the devastating cost of underestimating his father-in-law. The synthesized federal warning echoing from the public address system acted as a catalyst for pure, unadulterated chaos among the trapped Volkov syndicate operatives. The realization that they had walked blindly into a highly fortified federal sting operation completely shattered their criminal discipline. Instead of dropping their weapons and assuming the surrender positions dictated by the tactical commander, the hardened enforcers succumbed to a violent collective panic. Driven by sheer terror, the towering lieutenant who had nearly crushed Bradley's windpipe seconds earlier unleashed a furious guttural roar of defiance. He raised his heavy automatic rifle, flipped the selector switch to fully automatic, and aimed directly at the massive steel loading bay doors that blocked their only visible avenue of escape. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a continuous deafening torrent of high-velocity ammunition. The rest of the syndicate muscle immediately followed his disastrous lead, raising their own military-grade firearms and firing blindly into the impenetrable barricade. The cavernous warehouse erupted into a terrifying symphony of rapid gunfire and ejecting brass casings clattering onto the cold concrete floor. Muzzle flashes illuminated the dark space in erratic bursts, momentarily pushing back the harsh crimson glow of the emergency strobes. However, their desperate display of lethal force was an exercise in absolute futility. The heavy ballistic plates completely absorbed the sustained barrage. Sparks flew violently into the air as hundreds of rounds of ammunition ricocheted harmlessly off the reinforced armor, failing to dent the steel or penetrate the internal locking mechanisms. The deflected bullets zipped erratically across the loading bay, forcing several operatives to dive for cover to avoid being struck by their own friendly fire. They were utterly trapped, wasting their limited ammunition against a wall built specifically to withstand explosive artillery while the federal authorities finalized their breaching coordinates. The futile barrage of syndicate gunfire was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, shattering sound of high-impact glass breaking directly above them. Federal operatives stationed on the warehouse roof had systematically bypassed the reinforced skylights, creating a series of strategic overhead entry points. Before the armed thugs could tilt their weapons upward to address this new vertical threat, a synchronized volley of heavy tactical flashbang grenades plummeted through the shattered glass and bounced across the concrete floor. The explosive devices detonated simultaneously with a series of concussive shockwaves that physically buckled the air pressure inside the enclosed vault. A blinding, searing white light completely eradicated the crimson glow of the emergency strobes, momentarily turning the entire facility as bright as the midday sun. The sheer optical overload instantly blinded the syndicate operatives, burning their retinas and rendering their night vision entirely useless. The accompanying auditory blast registered at over 170 decibels, instantly rupturing eardrums and completely neutralizing the inner ear fluid that controlled their physical equilibrium. Heavily armed men dropped their rifles, clutching the sides of their heads as they collapsed onto their knees, overcome by intense nausea and absolute spatial disorientation. The precise, overwhelming sensory deprivation effectively crippled the syndicate's capacity for organized resistance in less than 3 seconds. The moment the flashbangs detonated, the external federal breach teams initiated their coordinated assault from every single perimeter entry point. Heavy explosive breaching charges obliterated the secondary maintenance doors, filling the access corridors with thick gray smoke and pulverized concrete. Dozens of highly trained hostage rescue team operators poured into the facility, their laser sights cutting through the lingering dust. They moved with terrifying, fluid precision, their tactical boots hitting the floor in perfect unison as they stormed the loading bay to dismantle the incapacitated criminal syndicate. I stood rigidly beside Agent Thorne inside the climate-controlled mobile command unit, my eyes locked onto the glowing infrared monitors capturing the chaotic tactical raid unfolding 2 miles away. The thermal imaging feeds clearly highlighted the federal operators as bright coordinated heat signatures systematically advancing upon the disorganized, flailing thermal blooms of the syndicate operatives. I watched the violent dismantling of the Volkov crew with absolute clinical detachment. I felt absolutely no pity for the men currently being thrown to the concrete and forcibly disarmed by the assault teams, and I held zero regret regarding the devastating trap I had meticulously engineered for my son-in-law. During the formative years of my logistics empire, I learned a brutal, unavoidable truth about protecting generational wealth and innocent family members from predatory external forces. If you show a predator even a fraction of an inch of vulnerability, they will relentlessly consume your entire world until nothing remains. When my wife passed away, I made a silent, unyielding vow to permanently shield Kendra from the violent realities of the corporate underworld I inhabited. I constructed an entire secondary identity as a humble working-class manager, specifically to keep her insulated from the lethal men who sought to exploit my assets. Bradley had aggressively shattered that protective barrier. By deliberately involving a vicious organized crime syndicate to cover his own pathetic financial failures, he had effectively placed a loaded gun directly to my daughter's head. He had invited violent predators into her home. Watching the federal team systematically dismantle his invincible criminal associates was not a simple act of vengeance. It was the necessary absolute eradication of an existential threat, ensuring that the men who dared to endanger my only child were permanently removed from the operational board. The federal tactical units swarmed across the warehouse floor with overwhelming, undeniable force, rapidly closing the distance between the breached access points and the central storage bay. A few of the less incapacitated syndicate operatives blindly raised their weapons in a final desperate act of defiance, pulling their triggers indiscriminately into the expanding clouds of breaching smoke. The resulting firefight was a massive, entirely one-sided display of tactical superiority. The hostage rescue team operators returned fire with controlled, precise bursts, instantly dropping the resisting gunmen before they could accurately acquire a single federal target. The sharp, rhythmic cracks of the tactical rifles echoed brutally across the massive concrete space, violently demonstrating the fatal consequences of engaging a prepared federal assault unit. Bradley did not attempt to stand his ground, nor did he make a single effort to assist the men he had personally guided into the trap. The absolute cowardice that defined his entire fraudulent existence completely overtook his basic motor functions. The exact millisecond the first flashbang detonated, Bradley abandoned his criminal partners entirely. He scrambled on his hands and knees across the filthy concrete, his tailored designer suit soaking up puddles of rainwater and industrial grease. He threw himself into a narrow, dark crevice behind a towering stack of wooden shipping pallets, desperately trying to fold his body into the smallest possible target. He curled into a tight, trembling ball, pressing his hands brutally hard over his ears in a pathetic attempt to block out the deafening gunfire and the agonized screams of the syndicate lieutenants being forcibly subdued. Bradley wept hysterically in the dark, gasping for air as he listened to his grandiose multi-million-dollar criminal salvation physically collapse into a devastating federal nightmare directly in front of him. Through the high-definition monitors, I watched the deafening symphony of automatic gunfire and shattering concrete abruptly cease, leaving behind a ringing, absolute silence that felt heavier than the preceding chaos. The tactical commander issued a crisp, definitive, all-clear signal that formally ended the primary engagement phase. The aggressive crimson glow of the emergency strobes instantly terminated as the primary commercial halogens surged back to life with a loud electrical hum. The sudden blinding return of the brilliant white light revealed the absolute devastation of the syndicate's assault and the flawless execution of the federal countermeasure. Across the sprawling expanse of the loading bay, the previously invincible enforcers of the Volkov syndicate were completely neutralized. Heavily armored hostage rescue team operators stood in perfectly coordinated overwatch positions, their laser sights securely trained on the incapacitated criminals. The syndicate members were pressed hard against the cold, grease-stained concrete, their hands immobilized tightly behind their backs with heavy-duty tactical zip ties. Their weapons had been aggressively kicked away, lying uselessly among the scattered brass casings and the pulverized debris of the breached walls. The towering lieutenant who had violently assaulted Bradley minutes earlier was pinned face down by two massive federal agents, his arrogant defiance entirely extinguished by the crushing reality of his capture. The warehouse transformed instantly from a chaotic battlefield into a highly organized crime scene processing center. Elite evidence recovery units began filtering through the secured perimeter, methodically documenting the seized firearms and securing the military drone technology the syndicate had foolishly attempted to steal. The sheer speed and lethal efficiency of the federal raid left the surviving criminals completely paralyzed with shock, stripped of their power and their freedom in a matter of violently choreographed seconds. Deep within the labyrinth of towering steel racks, the internal surveillance feeds captured two heavily armored operators sweeping the secondary sectors with disciplined precision. Their mounted tactical flashlights cut through the lingering dust of the breaching charges until the beams illuminated a pathetic, trembling figure wedged tightly into a narrow crevice. Bradley was cowering behind a massive stack of splintered wooden shipping pallets, his hands clamped brutally hard over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut in absolute terror. He had completely surrendered his dignity, actively attempting to merge with the filthy concrete floor to escape the violent consequences of his own arrogance. The federal agents did not offer him a polite request to surrender. They moved with aggressive, unyielding force. One operator reached down and grabbed Bradley roughly by the collar of his expensive, ruined designer suit, hoisting him violently upward. The sheer physical strength of the agent dragged the terrified executive completely out of his hiding space, leaving his expensive shoes dragging uselessly across the floor. Bradley shrieked as the agent threw him forcefully forward, sending him crashing face first onto the unforgiving concrete. Before he could attempt to scramble away, a heavy tactical boot pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him in place as thick plastic zip ties secured his wrists. Bradley immediately erupted into a hysterical, high-pitched frenzy of desperate denials. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he was an absolute victim, claiming he had been kidnapped and dragged to the facility against his will. He wept openly, thrashing against the unyielding grip of his captors, while fabricating a wild narrative about being forced to participate. The federal agents entirely ignored his pathetic, frantic lies, treating his emotional collapse with complete detachment as they hauled him upward to face the raid's tactical commander. I stepped out from the confines of the mobile command center, standing safely beneath its extended metal awning alongside Agent Thorne as the operators hauled Bradley out of the warehouse. The heavily armored agents gripped the sobbing executive tightly by his bound arms, marching him aggressively through the sprawling destruction and shoving him directly into the freezing torrential rain, hammering the exterior courtyard. The cold water immediately plastered his ruined hair against his forehead and soaked his torn suit to the skin, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the psychological devastation waiting for him. Bradley stumbled forward, slipping on the wet asphalt as he frantically scanned the chaotic scene. The entire industrial park was swarming with unmarked federal transport vehicles, heavily armed personnel, and flashing blue and red emergency lights cutting through the heavy downpour. As his frantic gaze swept across the impenetrable perimeter barricade, his eyes suddenly locked onto a sight that entirely paralyzed his frantic mind. He spotted me standing securely behind a phalanx of federal agents, taking a long, deliberate sip from a steaming cup of black coffee. I radiated absolute relaxed composure, watching his utter ruin with eyes completely devoid of any mercy, pity, or hesitation. I felt absolutely no regret watching the systematic destruction of the exact man who had dared to threaten my daughter's life. Bradley stared at the tableau in complete cognitive free fall. The fragile, pathetic illusion he had constructed over the past 4 years instantly disintegrated. The harmless blue-collar logistics manager he had mercilessly mocked and systematically attempted to bankrupt was standing at the absolute center of federal power. He realized in a single crushing instant that every piece of leverage he thought he possessed had been a meticulously engineered component of his own demise. The undeniable visual confirmation of my true position entirely shattered whatever remaining fragments of sanity Bradley still possessed. He lunged wildly against the iron grip of the arresting operators, thrashing his shoulders and screaming hysterically through the driving rain. He pointed his bound hands frantically in my direction, his voice cracking as he bellowed to the federal agents that they were arresting the wrong man. He aggressively claimed that I had deliberately set him up, shouting that the old man drinking coffee was the actual criminal mastermind responsible for the entire illegal operation. He spewed frantic, disjointed accusations about stolen keycards and corporate conspiracies, desperately hoping his fabricated narrative would shift the focus of the raid. Agent Thorne stepped forward from the shadow of the command center awning, allowing the heavy rain to bounce off his tactical vest. He looked down at Bradley's thrashing, pathetic display and let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut effortlessly through the noise of the idling armored vehicles. Thorne did not bother to correct Bradley's absurd accusations regarding my civilian identity or my decades of classified service. Instead, the federal commander took a slow, deliberate step closer, ensuring his words carried absolute, undeniable finality. He stared directly into Bradley's panicked eyes and informed the broken executive of his true reality. Thorne stated with clinical precision that Bradley had not simply trespassed on commercial property or attempted a standard corporate burglary. He explicitly informed the sobbing fraud that he had just personally orchestrated and led a heavily armed syndicate assault on a highly classified Level 4 United States military installation. The devastating weight of federal treason crashed down upon Bradley, guaranteeing his permanent incarceration inside a maximum security penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. He would never see a single day of freedom again. The chaotic roar of the rainy industrial courtyard was entirely replaced by the oppressive, sterile hum of fluorescent lights inside the federal holding facility. Bradley sat completely alone in the center of a windowless concrete interrogation room. The expensive tailored fabric of his designer suit was soaked through, stained with grease, and torn at the shoulders, stripping him of the superficial armor he had relied upon his entire life. His wrists were secured in heavy interlocking steel cuffs that were bolted directly to a thick metal ring embedded in the center of the immovable steel table. He tugged frantically at the thick metal chain, the sharp clinking sound echoing loudly against the barren cinder block walls. He was shivering violently, alternating between physical shock and a desperate calculating panic as his mind raced to construct a plausible defense. The heavy reinforced steel door suddenly unlatched with a sharp electronic buzz and swung open. Agent Thorne stepped into the interrogation room. The Federal Tactical Commander had discarded his heavy rain gear and ballistic vest, now wearing a crisp, dark suit that projected absolute terrifying authority. Thorne did not introduce himself, nor did he offer a standard reading of Miranda rights or basic pleasantries. He carried a massive, incredibly dense manila folder overflowing with documents and glossy photographs. He walked deliberately across the gray linoleum floor and dropped the colossal file directly onto the center of the steel table. The heavy thud of the paper striking the metal surface sounded like a gavel falling, instantly silencing Bradley's frantic chain rattling. Thorne pulled out the single metal chair opposite the captive executive and sat down, folding his large hands together and staring at Bradley with a cold, unblinking intensity that demanded total submission. The suffocating silence stretched on for a full minute, engineered entirely to break Bradley's remaining psychological defenses, but the cornered executive could not suppress his pathological need to manipulate the narrative. Bradley leaned forward as far as the heavy steel chains would allow, his voice trembling, but laced with a frantic, desperate urgency. He immediately attempted to throw Leland entirely under the bus, spinning a wild, fabricated tale of corporate coercion and victimization. He claimed that he was completely innocent, an oblivious pawn, manipulated by a vicious criminal mastermind masquerading as a retired logistics manager. Bradley frantically insisted that Leland had personally handed him the red electronic keycard and explicitly forced him to coordinate the clandestine transport of illicit goods. To sell the illusion of his innocence, Bradley weaponized his own marriage, claiming that Leland had threatened to physically harm Kendra if he did not comply with the syndicate's demands. He spoke rapidly, utilizing the practiced, persuasive cadence he had used to defraud dozens of venture capitalists over the past 4 years. He assumed Agent Thorne was simply an ambitious federal investigator looking to bag a high-profile corporate syndicate boss. Bradley squared his shoulders, attempting to project the false confidence of a valuable asset holding critical intelligence. He demanded full federal immunity from all pending charges, immediate placement into the witness protection program, and a secure transport back to his luxury estate in exchange for providing a comprehensive sworn testimony against his father-in-law. He promised to deliver the entire Sector 4 logistics network to the FBI on a silver platter, entirely convinced he could negotiate his way out of a federal holding cell just as easily as he had negotiated his fraudulent business loans. Agent Thorne did not interrupt the frantic, fabricated monologue, nor did he offer a single word of confirmation or denial. He simply reached forward and unclasped the heavy brass fasteners securing the massive manila folder. With slow, deliberate precision, Thorne began sliding high-resolution surveillance photographs across the cold steel table, arranging them in a neat, undeniable timeline of absolute guilt. The first image was a crystal-clear extreme close-up captured from a hidden micro-camera inside Bradley's own home office. It clearly depicted him sitting at his desk, actively using a digital stylus to expertly forge Kendra's signature on the fraudulent second mortgage documents. Bradley's desperate voice faltered slightly, but Thorne immediately slid the next set of photographs forward. These images showed Bradley standing inside Leland's private study, using a covert scanning device to meticulously copy the classified Federal Transit manifests he believed contained the locations of raw industrial platinum. The timestamp on the photograph perfectly matched the exact moment Leland had orchestrated the bait. The final devastating blow was delivered in a sequence of glossy, high-definition thermal and optical surveillance shots taken outside the underground VIP clubs in the city's criminal district. The images perfectly captured Bradley wearing his signature tailored suits, smiling aggressively and shaking hands with 3 heavily armed, high-ranking lieutenants of the Volkov organized crime syndicate. The men were documented targets on international federal watch lists. Thorne sat back in his chair and watched the remaining color completely drain from Bradley's face. The physical evidence completely annihilated the fabricated narrative of coercion and victimization. Every single illegal action, every forged signature, and every clandestine meeting with foreign mafia enforcers had been recorded, cataloged, and verified by Leland's private security network and handed directly to federal prosecutors. The absolute reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining spark of arrogance out of Bradley's mind. He stared down at the glossy photographs of himself consorting with known Russian mobsters, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Agent Thorne leaned heavily across the bolted steel table, bringing his face mere inches from the shivering executive. Thorne's voice dropped to a low, lethal whisper that carried the absolute unyielding weight of the United States federal government. He informed Bradley that the district attorney was completely bypassing standard corporate fraud, grand larceny, and commercial burglary charges. Thorne explained with clinical, terrifying clarity that Sector 4 logistics was not a civilian target. By stealing classified access codes and using them to deliberately bypass the security grids of a designated Department of Defense black site, Bradley had crossed an irreversible legal threshold. The situation escalated exponentially the moment he guided a dozen heavily armed, undocumented foreign nationals into a facility housing highly sensitive, restricted military-grade drone technology. Thorne stated that the FBI was not treating this as an attempted robbery. The federal government officially categorized the assault as a coordinated, hostile incursion by a domestic enemy combatant acting in concert with a foreign criminal enterprise. Bradley's eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror as Thorne delivered the final, inescapable verdict. There would be no plea deals, no corporate bailouts, and absolutely no immunity. The United States Department of Justice was officially indicting Bradley for espionage, armed domestic terrorism, and high treason. Thorne leaned back, adjusting his suit jacket, and calmly informed the weeping fraud that he would be transferred to a federal supermax facility before dawn, where he would permanently disappear from the civilized world. I returned to the polished, climate-controlled silence of my primary executive suite at Sector 4 Logistics, just as the sun began to rise over the industrial park. The intense, high-stakes operation of the previous night had transitioned smoothly into a methodical, bureaucratic dismantling of a criminal empire. Sitting behind my heavy mahogany desk, I reviewed the incoming encrypted reports from Agent Thorne with a sense of profound satisfaction. The federal raid had yielded unprecedented results. The dozen heavily armed Volkov syndicate enforcers captured inside the warehouse were not hardened ideological warriors. They were opportunistic criminals facing the terrifying reality of domestic terrorism charges. Confronted with the absolute certainty of spending the remainder of their natural lives inside a federal supermax facility, their loyalty to the syndicate evaporated instantly. By mid-morning, 3 of the highest-ranking lieutenants had already signed comprehensive cooperation agreements with the Department of Justice. They traded decades of meticulously guarded operational secrets, logistics routes, and the identities of corrupt municipal officials in a desperate bid to reduce their sentences. This sudden, massive influx of highly actionable intelligence provided the federal authorities with the exact tactical leverage required to completely dismantle the local syndicate network. Joint task forces launched simultaneous, synchronized raids across the city, kicking down the doors of illegal underground casinos, unearthing hidden weapons caches, and freezing the illicit assets of the organization's regional commanders. The Volkov syndicate, which had operated with brazen impunity for over a decade, was being systematically erased from the map in a matter of hours. The aggressive, unyielding federal response ensured that no residual elements of the organization would possess the resources or the operational capacity to retaliate against my family. With the physical threat against my daughter permanently neutralized, I immediately shifted my entire focus toward the restoration of her stolen financial security. Bradley had meticulously drained Kendra's personal checking accounts, emptied her emergency savings, and violently leveraged the equity of her home to purchase his intended freedom. He had routed the stolen capital through a complex, digitally obfuscated network of offshore shell companies, believing the funds were completely untraceable. He profoundly underestimated the sheer aggressive power of my corporate legal division. I did not rely on the slow bureaucratic machinery of federal financial investigators to track the stolen money. Instead, I unleashed a specialized team of ruthless corporate litigators directly employed by my enterprise. These men and women were predatory financial experts who specialized in dismantling hostile corporate takeovers and tracing deeply buried assets across international borders. Operating from a secure boardroom down the hall, my legal team systematically attacked the digital architecture of Bradley's money laundering operation. They filed emergency injunctions across multiple international jurisdictions, utilizing leveraged corporate relationships to bypass standard banking delays. Within 48 hours, they successfully breached the digital firewalls of the primary offshore shell corporation holding the stolen mortgage funds. My attorneys executed a series of aggressive legal maneuvers instantly and permanently, freezing the accounts before a single dollar could be routed to Bradley's intended beneficiaries in Eastern Europe. The rapid, unyielding legal assault completely secured the stolen capital, initiating the formal expedited process of asset recovery. I ensured that every single cent Bradley had stolen from my daughter would be meticulously extracted from those frozen accounts and returned directly to her, fully restoring the financial foundation he had attempted to obliterate. The systematic annihilation of the Volkov Syndicate's regional operations did not go entirely unanswered. The imprisoned leader of the local syndicate faction, a vicious and historically untouchable criminal, was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding cell awaiting his treason arraignment. Stripped of his power and facing absolute ruin, his initial shock rapidly mutated into a desperate, blinding rage directed entirely at me. Operating under the arrogant assumption that his remaining external communication channels were still secure, the syndicate boss attempted to organize a highly lucrative targeted hit on my life from behind bars. He utilized a complex, multi-layered cipher during a monitored legal phone call intending to activate a sleeper cell of freelance assassins operating outside the traditional syndicate hierarchy. During the volatile expansion phase of my logistics empire, I had survived multiple assassination attempts orchestrated by aggressive corporate rivals and black market cartels. Those early brutal lessons had fundamentally shaped my approach to personal security. I never relied on hope or external law enforcement to protect my life. My corporate cybersecurity division, a unit staffed by former intelligence agency digital warfare specialists, operated a continuous illegal dragnet over all communications originating from the high-value targets housed in that specific federal facility. They intercepted the syndicate boss's encrypted communication within minutes of the call ending. My analysts effortlessly cracked the outdated cipher, entirely exposing the details of the hit contract, the intended payout, and the specific assassination team tasked with the execution. The imprisoned criminal believed he was striking a lethal, invisible blow from the shadows, entirely oblivious to the fact that I held absolute, real-time control over his entire digital reality. I possessed the intercepted audio files and the decoded assassination contract, giving me more than enough actionable evidence to involve Agent Thorne and guarantee the syndicate boss faced additional federal conspiracy charges. However, standard legal retaliation was an entirely insufficient response to a direct threat against my life. I required an absolute, immediate resolution that would send a terrifying message to any remaining criminal elements. I chose not to call the police or alert the federal authorities. Instead, I paid a highly personal, completely unannounced visit to the syndicate boss's private defense attorney at his polished downtown law firm. I bypassed his startled receptionist and walked directly into his expansive corner office, locking the heavy oak door behind me. The attorney, a man accustomed to manipulating the legal system for violent clients, demanded to know who I was and threatened to call building security. I ignored his posturing and dropped a single, terrifyingly detailed financial dossier onto his pristine glass desk. I calmly informed him that my corporate litigators had mapped the entirety of his firm's hidden financial structure, explicitly detailing the illegal retainer funds he had accepted from the Volkov Syndicate over the past decade. I delivered a chilling, undeniable financial ultimatum. I promised the attorney that unless the assassination contract was permanently and entirely canceled within the next 10 minutes, I would utterly destroy his life. I swore to instantly forward the complete financial dossier to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Prosecutor's Office, ensuring the immediate freezing of his firm's assets, his permanent disbarment, and his inevitable incarceration alongside his criminal clients. The attorney stared at the undeniable proof of his own illegal complicity, his arrogant demeanor completely collapsing as he desperately reached for his secure phone to cancel the hit. The swift and brutal dismantling of the Volkov Syndicate was merely the physical component of my retaliation. The financial and legal eradication of my former son-in-law remained. Armed with the absolute certainty of his permanent federal incarceration, Kendra wasted zero time mourning the illusion of her marriage. She marched directly into family court and filed an aggressive, expedited petition for a complete legal annulment and an immediate severing of all marital assets. The sheer magnitude of the federal charges levied against Bradley triggered a desperate scramble for resources. Stripped of his illicit syndicate funding and completely locked out of the offshore shell accounts my corporate litigators had frozen, Bradley was forced to rely on an overwhelmed, outgunned public defender. The initial legal maneuver from Bradley's defense camp was entirely predictable and breathtakingly arrogant. His appointed counsel attempted to legally leverage Kendra's remaining personal assets and the equity of her home to finance Bradley's monumental federal defense costs. They filed motions arguing that the financial liabilities acquired during the marriage, including the catastrophic debt he owed to the now dismantled syndicate, were shared burdens. They sought a court order to liquidate Kendra's restored savings explicitly, intending to bleed my daughter dry one final time to pay for the lawyers necessary to fight his treason and domestic terrorism indictments. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to maintain control from behind the reinforced glass of a maximum security holding facility. They genuinely believed that standard marital law would shield a traitor from the financial consequences of his own treason. They were entirely unprepared for the legal obliteration I had meticulously prepared for them. The family court proceeding was heavily guarded, reflecting the severe nature of Bradley's federal custody status. Heavily armed marshals escorted him into the brightly lit courtroom, his wrists and ankles bound in heavy steel transit chains. He wore a stark, bright orange federal prison jumpsuit, a glaring contrast to the expensive tailored Italian suits he had weaponized to deceive my daughter. Despite the undeniable reality of his impending life sentence, an unsettling, arrogant smirk spread across his face the moment he saw Kendra sitting at the petitioner's table. His narcissism was pathological and entirely immune to consequence. Bradley looked at his terrified wife and genuinely believed he still held the ultimate trump card. He whispered eagerly to his public defender, completely convinced that the rigid statutes of state marital law would legally force Kendra to absorb half of his crippling financial liabilities. In his fractured, desperate mind, if he was going down, the legal system would guarantee he dragged her down into the abyss alongside him. He assumed the court would mandate the sale of her home to satisfy his offshore gambling markers and cover the exorbitant legal fees required for a federal treason defense. He stared at Kendra with a look of venomous triumph, confident that the marriage certificate they had signed 4 years ago was a binding contract of mutual destruction. He sat back in his wooden chair, the chains rattling against the floor, waiting for the judge to validate his delusional sense of shared ruin. He possessed no understanding that the legal battlefield he had just entered was entirely controlled by the very man he had so foolishly attempted to destroy. Bradley's smug, arrogant composure instantly shattered the moment the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. I did not enter the room alone. Flanking me was a phalanx of my most aggressive, high-powered corporate litigators, men and women who specialized in annihilating hostile corporate entities and dismantling complex financial fraud. They bypassed the standard pleasantries and marched directly to the judge's bench, carrying dense, meticulously organized binders of irrefutable forensic evidence. During the terrifying hours Kendra spent locked inside the secure hotel suite, my elite cybersecurity division had entirely reverse-engineered Bradley's digital life. My attorneys did not present circumstantial arguments or emotional appeals. They submitted absolute mathematically perfect proof. They handed the judge a comprehensive forensic audit explicitly detailing Bradley's precise digital footprint, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had intentionally and maliciously forged Kendra's signature on the ruinous second mortgage documents. They presented the scraped metadata from his devices, capturing the exact keystrokes he used to violently drain her private checking accounts and max out her credit lines. Every stolen dollar was tracked through the digital ether directly to the offshore shell companies he had established with the Volkov syndicate. They slid high-resolution surveillance photographs across the polished oak table, displaying Bradley nervously shaking hands with the known foreign operatives, proving his actions were entirely unilateral, criminal, and hidden from his wife. The evidence completely isolated Bradley from the protections of marital asset division. It legally classified his actions not as shared financial mismanagement, but as predatory targeted theft against an unwitting victim. The illusion of a shared marital burden evaporated entirely, replaced by the stark, documented reality of a calculated, devastating financial assault. The presiding judge slammed the heavy forensic binders shut, his face flushed with unadulterated righteous fury. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal and the brazen criminality laid out before him eradicated any possibility of standard legal debate. He looked down at Bradley not as a petitioner in a family dispute, but as a convicted predator attempting to manipulate the court. The judge did not hesitate. He issued a rapid, aggressive ruling from the bench, instantly and permanently severing Kendra from all financial liability related to Bradley's catastrophic debts, his offshore gambling markers, and his mounting federal legal defense costs. With a sharp strike of his gavel, the judge officially granted the full annulment, legally declaring the marriage entirely void and fraudulent from its inception. He did not stop there. Citing the overwhelming evidence of financial abuse and the severe, violent nature of Bradley's federal charges, the judge issued a permanent, lifetime restraining order legally barring Bradley from ever contacting or approaching Kendra again. Bradley's public defender immediately stopped taking notes, silently packing his briefcase, as the absolute totality of the defeat settled over the courtroom. Bradley was left entirely irreversibly bankrupt. He possessed zero remaining assets, no property to leverage, and absolutely no legal claim to the wealth he had so desperately attempted to steal. He stared at the judge in paralyzing shock, his arrogant smirk replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a man completely devoid of options. The federal marshals grabbed his arms, hauling him up from the wooden chair by his heavy steel chains. He was dragged out of the family court and back toward the armored federal transport vehicle entirely alone, completely resourceless and facing the absolute certainty of the federal prosecution meat grinder. The heavy oak doors of the family court closed firmly behind us, sealing Bradley inside a legal and financial tomb of his own making. I guided Kendra out of the suffocating bureaucratic atmosphere and into the crisp afternoon air, leading her toward the waiting town car. We drove back to her suburban estate in a profound, absolute silence that felt entirely different from the oppressive tension that had plagued her marriage for the past 4 years. The dark-tinted windows of the vehicle shielded us from the chaotic aftermath of the courthouse, offering a quiet, moving sanctuary as we navigated the familiar roads. This silence was not born of fear or anxious anticipation. It was the sound of true, unadulterated liberation. When I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, the sprawling house greeted us with an emptiness that felt physically cleansing. The lingering scent of Bradley's expensive, overpowering cologne had already begun to fade from the foyer, taking the invisible weight of his towering arrogance with it. Kendra walked slowly through the quiet living room, trailing her fingertips along the edges of the furniture, as if she were experiencing her own home for the very first time. The shadows that had once dominated the corners of the property were completely gone, replaced by the brilliant afternoon sunlight pouring through the massive bay windows. We moved instinctively toward the kitchen and sat down opposite each other at the heavy polished wood dining table. This was the exact spot where just a few short weeks prior Bradley had smugly poured himself a glass of imported scotch and mercilessly mocked my worn flannel shirt. He had sat in that very chair and confidently humiliated me, treating me like a pathetic, financially ruined old man who possessed zero capacity to defend his own blood. Now that same man was chained to the floor of a federal transport vehicle. While I sat comfortably in the warmth of my daughter's secured home, Kendra stared down at the polished grain of the mahogany table, her shoulders finally dropping as the massive adrenaline spike of the courtroom confrontation began to gradually subside. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with the deep fatigue of a woman who had just narrowly escaped absolute financial and emotional annihilation. I watched the last remaining traces of fear slowly evaporate from her expression, replaced by a quiet, lingering confusion regarding how we had actually survived the legal onslaught. I did not offer her empty platitudes or generic words of comfort regarding the long healing process ahead. Instead, I reached deliberately inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers closed around the smooth, heavy material of a sleek black leather folder I had secured just hours before the court proceeding began. I pulled the document holder free and placed the item squarely onto the center of the table. The dark leather contrasted sharply against the bright sunlit wood. I rested my hand on top of the folder for a brief moment, feeling the undeniable weight of the documented salvation held within its pages. I looked directly into Kendra's tired eyes and gently pushed the leather folio across the table until it came to a halt directly in front of her folded hands. I kept my voice entirely calm, completely devoid of the aggressive, commanding authority I had projected inside the courtroom just an hour prior. I simply instructed her to open it. I told her that the federal government had successfully dismantled the immediate physical threat to her life, but it was my absolute duty as her father to dismantle the ruinous aftermath Bradley had left behind. I watched her hesitate, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the brass clasp securing the dark leather cover. She had been conditioned over the past month to expect only devastating news from official legal documents. Kendra unfastened the brass clasp and slowly flipped the heavy leather cover open, her eyes darting nervously toward the first sheet of thick watermarked paper. The breath hitched violently in her throat as she recognized the official seals of the county clerk's office. It was the original deed to her home. However, the crushing, fraudulent second mortgage that Bradley had illegally attached to the property was entirely gone. A heavy red notarized stamp boldly declared the title completely unencumbered and fully paid off. During the chaotic days following the federal raid, my corporate legal team had not merely frozen Bradley's offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. They had aggressively repatriated the stolen funds, utilizing the recovered capital to systematically annihilate the fraudulent liens placed against her estate. Kendra traced her trembling fingers over the embossed seal, unable to comprehend the impossible reality of possessing a completely free and clear title. But the deed was only the beginning. With infinite care, she lifted the real estate document to reveal a secondary file resting beneath it. This was a private, highly secured trust account contract established with an elite international banking institution. The primary beneficiary listed at the top of the page was Kendra herself. I watched a tear break loose and slide down her cheek as she read the precise, heavily protected balance printed at the bottom of the ledger. Every single dollar Bradley had violently drained from her checking accounts, every cent he had stolen from her emergency savings, and the entirety of her liquidated retirement funds had been fully restored. The money had been meticulously tracked, forcefully extracted from the syndicate's laundering network, and deposited securely into an impenetrable financial fortress that no future predator could ever access. Her financial independence was totally resurrected. Kendra's tear-filled eyes remained locked onto the staggering multi-million-dollar figure displayed on the trust document. Her gaze shifted frantically between the impossible balance and the legally binding signature I had personally authorized at the bottom of the page. The profound cognitive dissonance completely overwhelmed her. She looked up at me, her expression a complex mixture of absolute awe, overwhelming relief, and profound confusion. The entire foundation of her reality was instantly rewritten. The blue-collar logistics manager she had known her entire life. The humble man who drove a battered pickup truck and wore faded denim was the sole signatory on an international trust fund holding massive generation-defining wealth. She realized in that crushing, beautiful moment that her father was an undisputed corporate titan. Her voice shook as she asked the unavoidable question. She demanded to know why I had deliberately chosen to live such a remarkably simple, invisible life. She asked why I had silently allowed Bradley to treat me like a worthless, uneducated janitor for 4 years when I possessed the unmitigated power to financially crush him at any given moment. I leaned back in the dining chair, feeling the absolute peace of a fully executed mission settling deep into my bones. I looked at my daughter and offered a calm, unwavering truth forged through decades of brutal corporate warfare. I explained that wealth is merely a practical tool, not a theatrical costume designed to demand superficial respect. Displaying massive resources only serves to attract ruthless predators and invite unnecessary vulnerabilities. I told her that enduring Bradley's pathetic arrogance was a minor calculated price to pay to maintain my anonymity and secure her protection. I smiled softly, assuring her that true absolute power never needs to announce its presence until the exact moment it decides to strike. The crushing reality of permanent federal incarceration finally settled over Bradley, like a suffocating shroud inside his windowless 6x8 concrete holding cell. The sterile, unblinking fluorescent lights of the maximum security facility illuminated the absolute, undeniable ruin of his carefully constructed life. He spent his first 72 hours entirely isolated from the outside world, stripped of his tailored suits, his illicit offshore accounts, and the intoxicating arrogance that had defined his entire fraudulent existence. His overworked federal public defender had delivered the devastating legal assessment without a single shred of sympathy or hesitation. There would be no bail hearings, no corporate plea deals, and absolutely no leniency from the United States Department of Justice. The espionage and domestic terrorism indictments carried mandatory life sentences, ensuring Bradley would die behind reinforced steel doors. The sheer, inescapable permanence of his situation completely broke his remaining psychological defenses. Panic consumed his mind entirely. He paced the narrow length of his cell, his breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps as he finally realized his profound isolation. His former associates within the Volkov syndicate were either dead, actively cooperating with federal prosecutors, or actively plotting his murder from neighboring cell blocks. His offshore financial safety nets had been legally obliterated by my corporate litigators. He had absolutely zero leverage left to negotiate with the federal government. Driven by a primal, desperate survival instinct, Bradley hammered his bruised fists against the heavy steel door of his cell until the guards finally summoned his attorney. He collapsed into the plastic chair of the attorney-client consultation room, weeping openly as he delivered his final, pathetic request. He begged his exhausted public defender to arrange a face-to-face meeting with me, clinging to the delusional hope that he could still manipulate the man he had previously dismissed as a harmless logistics manager. I agreed to the visitation request strictly to witness the final absolute destruction of the man who had actively sought to destroy my daughter. The federal Supermax facility was a fortress of imposing gray concrete, heavily armed tactical guards, and overlapping biometric security checkpoints. I was escorted by the facility warden through a labyrinth of heavy steel corridors until we reached the stark, heavily fortified visitor center. I sat down in a rigid metal chair, placing my hands calmly onto the counter beneath a thick partition of reinforced bulletproof glass. A heavy steel door on the opposite side of the partition unlatched with a loud mechanical clank. Two massive federal marshals dragged Bradley into the designated visitation booth, forcing him down into the bolted chair before securing his waist chains to the steel floor ring. The physical transformation he had undergone in just a few short weeks was genuinely staggering. The slick, arrogant corporate executive who had effortlessly charmed venture capitalists and mocked my working-class wardrobe was entirely gone. Bradley looked severely emaciated, his cheekbones jutting sharply against his pale, unhealthy skin. His eyes were bloodshot, completely sunken into dark, bruised sockets that betrayed weeks of unrelenting terror and absolute sleep deprivation. He trembled violently inside his oversized orange prison jumpsuit, his posture folded inward like a beaten animal expecting another physical blow. He stared at me through the thick ballistic glass, his gaze completely devoid of its former malicious confidence. He was utterly broken, reduced to a hollow, frantic shell of a human being. I did not offer a greeting, nor did I show a single fraction of an inch of sympathy. I sat in absolute clinical silence, watching him squirm under the crushing weight of my unyielding gaze, waiting for his inevitable attempt at deception. Bradley snatched the heavy black plastic receiver from the wall intercom with violently shaking hands, pressing it hard against his ear as tears immediately began streaming down his hollow cheeks. He did not attempt to maintain his dignity or deny his criminal actions. Instead, he launched directly into a frantic, meticulously calculated campaign of emotional manipulation. His voice cracked with manufactured anguish as he begged me to intervene with the federal prosecutors, desperately pleading for me to use my classified governmental influence to reduce his terrorism charges to simple corporate fraud. He attempted to rewrite the entire narrative of his systemic abuse and theft, casting himself as a tragic, misguided victim of his own profound love for my daughter. During the 4 years of his fraudulent marriage to Kendra, he had never once demonstrated genuine affection. Yet now he weaponized her name with rehearsed desperation. He sobbed into the receiver, claiming that he had only forged her signature and stolen the mortgage funds because he was drowning in the immense pressure to provide a beautiful, excessively wealthy life for her. He spun a pathetic story about his own impoverished childhood, claiming he had partnered with the Volkov syndicate only because he was terrified of failing Kendra as a provider. He insisted that every illegal shell company, every stolen dollar, and every treasonous act of corporate espionage was driven entirely by a desperate, blinding desire to make her proud. He pressed his free hand against the bulletproof glass, staring at me with wide, pleading eyes, begging for the mercy of a father-in-law he had relentlessly humiliated. He firmly believed that if he played the role of the broken, remorseful husband, my paternal instincts would override my absolute judgment, blinding me to his true predatory nature. I stared back at his tear-streaked face with absolute freezing detachment, allowing his pathetic, fabricated monologue to echo uselessly inside the sterile visitation booth. I did not interrupt his frantic performance. nor did I offer a single word of forgiveness or validation. When he finally ran out of breath and collapsed back into his steel chair, waiting desperately for a lifeline, I smoothly reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I extracted a small, sleek digital audio recorder and placed it deliberately onto the steel counter directly beneath the intercom microphone. Without breaking eye contact, I pressed the playback button. The audio quality was pristine, captured weeks earlier by my elite cybersecurity division during their systemic infiltration of his private communication network. Bradley's own arrogant, sneering voice instantly echoed through the heavy plastic receiver pressed against his ear. The recorded conversation explicitly detailed his ultimate exit strategy to a high-ranking syndicate lieutenant. He did not know I was listening as he explicitly laid out his timeline to permanently abandon Kendra the exact moment the stolen federal drone technology was secured. The recording captured him ruthlessly laughing about leaving her entirely bankrupt, burdened with his massive offshore debts and facing inevitable foreclosure. The final devastating sentence of the audio file was Bradley explicitly demanding the syndicate utilize their enforcers to permanently eliminate the old man to ensure nobody was left to protect her. The color completely drained from Bradley's gaunt face, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. The digital recorder severed his final desperate illusion of control. He dropped the plastic receiver, his mouth opening in silent, paralyzing horror as the absolute reality of his situation crystallized. His final manipulation had failed entirely, cementing his permanent destruction inside a federal cage. The stark, suffocating concrete of the federal holding facility transitioned seamlessly into the imposing polished mahogany grandeur of the United States District Court. The massive courtroom was filled to absolute capacity, the wooden gallery benches packed tightly with investigative journalists, heavily armed tactical operators, and senior federal prosecutors who had meticulously built the case. The air hummed with a tense, expectant energy, completely devoid of the usual bureaucratic murmurs that defined standard corporate fraud hearings. At the center of this overwhelming spectacle stood Bradley. The devastating reality of his failed plea bargain had entirely hollowed him out. He stood before the elevated bench of the federal judge, heavily restrained by thick steel transit chains that bound his wrists to his waist and shackled his ankles. Stripped completely of his meticulously tailored Italian suits, his imported silk ties, and the stolen wealth that had fueled his pathological arrogance, he looked utterly and completely pathetic. The bright orange fabric of his standard-issue prison jumpsuit hung loosely over his rapidly emaciated frame, highlighting the intense physical toll of his unmitigated terror. He kept his bloodshot eyes fixed firmly on the floor, entirely unable to meet the piercing stares of the federal agents who had violently dismantled his syndicate operation just weeks prior. Bradley shifted nervously on his feet, the heavy chains rattling loudly against the polished hardwood floor, projecting the frantic, helpless energy of a cornered animal, realizing there were absolutely no remaining avenues of escape. The impenetrable facade of the invincible, high-rolling corporate executive had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified, bankrupt criminal facing the absolute zenith of the American judicial system. The presiding federal judge adjusted his reading glasses and looked down from the elevated bench, his expression etched with a profound, unyielding severity. He did not address Bradley as a misguided businessman or a desperate corporate casualty caught in a bad financial position. The judge's voice boomed across the silent courtroom, carrying the absolute authority of the federal government as he systematically detailed the staggering magnitude of the offenses. He outlined with clinical precision how Bradley had deliberately and maliciously orchestrated an armed, coordinated assault on a classified Department of Defense logistics hub. The judge read directly from the comprehensive forensic indictments, explicitly highlighting Bradley's active, enthusiastic collusion with high-ranking enforcers of the internationally sanctioned Volkov Syndicate. He described the infiltration of foreign nationals onto sovereign government soil, the deployment of military-grade breaching explosives, and the attempted theft of highly restricted drone technology. The judge systematically dismantled every single fabricated defense Bradley's legal counsel had desperately attempted to submit during the pre-trial hearings. He pointed directly to the intercepted audio recordings and the encrypted offshore bank transfers as absolute, irrefutable proof of premeditated treason. This was not a crime born of sudden financial desperation or familial coercion, as Bradley had so pathetically tried to claim. The judge made it terrifyingly clear to the entire packed gallery that Bradley had weaponized his marital access forged federal manifests and actively endangered the lives of federal operators strictly to finance his own gluttonous, narcissistic lifestyle. The sheer scale of the betrayal against both his family and national security demanded a response that would serve as a permanent, undeniable deterrent to any future corporate predator attempting to sell classified assets to violent foreign syndicates. Seated quietly in the very last row of the crowded gallery, completely unnoticed by the swarming journalists and federal prosecutors, I watched the systematic legal annihilation of my former son-in-law. I wore a simple, understated dark suit. My posture relaxed, my expression completely unreadable as I observed the proceedings with absolute clinical detachment. As the judge continued to outline the extensive syndicate conspiracy, my mind drifted back to the exact moment this inevitable chain of events was set into motion. I remembered sitting at Kendra's polished dining room table 4 years ago, quietly eating my dinner while Bradley casually poured himself a glass of imported $1,000 scotch. I remembered the exact arrogant smirk on his face as he looked across the table and openly mocked my faded flannel shirt, and my calloused hands treating me like an ignorant blue-collar relic who possessed zero understanding of the modern world. Bradley had critically misjudged my silence for weakness. He had failed to comprehend that a man who had spent 3 decades engineering covert logistics networks for classified intelligence agencies does not react to superficial insults with loud emotional tantrums. Every condescending remark he hurled in my direction, every blatant display of his predatory greed had been a vital data point I meticulously collected and analyzed. I had deliberately allowed him to believe he was the smartest man in the room, utilizing his own insatiable arrogance to quietly guide him toward a flawlessly designed federal tripwire. I had built the absolute perfect trap insulating my daughter from the blast radius and simply waited for him to confidently step directly onto the trigger. The heavy silence in the courtroom reached a suffocating peak as the judge closed the massive indictment binder and leaned forward, locking his fierce gaze onto the trembling defendant. The judge pronounced the final, inescapable verdict with a voice that echoed like thunder against the wood-paneled walls. He sentenced Bradley to 35 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. To ensure the absolute finality of the punishment, the judge explicitly and strictly denied any future possibility of early parole, good behavior reductions, or appellate leniency. The heavy wooden gavel struck the polished sound block with a sharp, violent crack that sealed Bradley's fate permanently. The remaining strength in Bradley's legs instantly evaporated. He let out a ragged, agonizing gasp and physically collapsed against the defense table, his heavy steel transit chains clattering wildly as he buried his face in his bound hands. He began sobbing uncontrollably, his hysterical wails echoing through the gallery as the crushing reality of spending the rest of his natural life inside a concrete cage finally set in. The courtroom immediately erupted into a chaotic flurry of movement as journalists scrambled toward the exits to file their breaking reports, and federal marshals moved in to physically haul the broken executive away. I watched Bradley's pathetic weeping display for exactly 1 second. I did not smile, nor did I offer any gesture of triumphant vindication. I simply turned my back on the ruined man, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and walked smoothly out into the bright, cleansing sunlight of the city, leaving him entirely alone in the dark. I pushed open the heavy, brass-handled oak doors of the United States District Courthouse, leaving the suffocating bureaucratic theater of the federal justice system entirely behind me. The thick mahogany sealed shut with a resonant thud, instantly cutting off the chaotic murmur of investigative journalists and the muffled, pathetic sobbing of the man who had foolishly attempted to dismantle my family. I stepped out onto the wide granite portico and inhaled deeply. The morning air was incredibly crisp, cutting through the lingering scent of stale courtroom varnish and nervous sweat. It was a remarkably clean breeze, utterly devoid of the oppressive, invisible tension that had hung heavily over our lives for the past 4 years. The dark clouds of the syndicate's violent threat had completely dissipated, leaving a brilliant, unobstructed sky in their wake. I walked down the expansive stone steps with a measured, deliberate pace, my posture straight and unburdened. At the base of the courthouse stairs, parked conspicuously among the sleek black federal transport vehicles and expensive corporate sedans, sat my weathered, reliable Ford pickup truck. Leaning confidently against the dented quarter panel was Kendra. She wore a simple, elegant coat, her posture projecting a profound, unbreakable strength that mirrored the very foundation I had instilled in her since childhood. She stood proudly beside the battered vehicle that Bradley had so routinely mocked, entirely unashamed of the blue-collar aesthetics that masked our true power. Her eyes met mine as I approached the curb, and a silent mutual understanding passed between us. The nightmare was officially terminated. We had weathered the absolute worst of a predatory assault, systematically eradicated the enemy, and emerged entirely intact. As I reached the truck, Kendra opened the passenger door without uttering a single word. There was absolutely no desire for a grand celebration. We did not exchange triumphant smiles, nor did we feel the urge to cheer the devastating sentence the federal judge had just handed down. There is fundamentally no joy to be found in watching a human being get physically dragged away in heavy steel chains to rot inside a barren concrete cage for the remainder of their natural life. The absolute destruction of Bradley's existence was a tragedy born entirely of his own insatiable greed and pathological arrogance, a miserable collapse that warranted clinical observation rather than applause. Instead of jubilation, a profound, heavy silence enveloped us, bringing with it an overwhelming sense of deep, abiding satisfaction. It was the primal, necessary satisfaction of a father successfully executing his most fundamental duty. I had identified a severe, lethal threat to my bloodline and systematically neutralized it with absolute, unapologetic precision. Bradley had invited violent foreign mercenaries into our world, deliberately placing a loaded weapon against the future of my only daughter. Eradicating that threat was not a matter of petty vengeance or bruised ego. It was an essential biological imperative to secure the continuation and safety of my family. We settled into the worn fabric seats of the truck, the familiar scent of old leather and motor oil wrapping around us like a protective shield. The engine turned over with a reliable heavy rumble, entirely drowning out the distant sirens of the city. We pulled away from the courthouse curb, leaving the legal wreckage and the shattered remnants of Bradley's fraudulent empire in our rearview mirror, completely focused on the untainted horizon ahead. The drive back to my modest suburban property was characterized by a deep, entirely comfortable silence. We did not need to dissect the trial, recount the judge's furious ruling, or analyze the pathetic collapse of the man who had orchestrated the betrayal. The legal and financial mechanisms had functioned exactly as I had engineered them, requiring no further commentary. I navigated the heavy pickup truck through the quiet, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood, pulling smoothly into the narrow concrete driveway of the unassuming single-story house I had owned for decades. The structure was plain, entirely unremarkable, and completely devoid of any exterior indicators of the massive international trust funds and classified corporate power I wielded. It was the exact house where I had raised Kendra, the place where she had learned the fundamental difference between genuine substance and hollow performance. I walked through the front door feeling the familiar, grounded energy of a home built on absolute authenticity rather than leveraged debt. I went directly into my bedroom and unbuttoned the crisp, tailored suit jacket I had worn for the federal tribunal. I carefully hung the expensive garment in the closet, physically shedding the corporate armor required for the judicial battlefield. I reached for a worn pair of faded denim jeans and a thick, comfortable flannel shirt, pulling the soft fabric over my shoulders with a deep sigh of relief. Lacing up my scuffed, steel-toed work boots, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was not playing a character or hiding behind a carefully crafted disguise. I was exactly who I had always been. The wealth had never changed my core identity. I was a builder, a worker, a man defined entirely by his hands and his unyielding principles. I drove the old pickup truck back across the city limits, heading directly toward the sprawling industrial perimeter of Sector 4 Logistics. As I approached the heavily fortified entrance of Warehouse 7, the massive reinforced steel gates retracted smoothly, recognizing the encrypted transponder hidden beneath my dashboard. The facility had been fully secured following the violent raid against the Volkov Syndicate, operating now under a heightened absolute lockdown protocol. I parked my vehicle near the primary loading bay and stepped out onto the cold asphalt. A perimeter team of heavily armed federal agents immediately turned in my direction. I nodded to them with genuine quiet respect, acknowledging their critical role in dismantling the foreign threat that had breached my domain. They returned the silent greeting, fully aware of the sheer operational power I commanded from the shadows of this concrete labyrinth. I walked past the perimeter checkpoints and entered the cavernous expanse of the central logistics dock. The area was quiet, the heavy machinery resting silently between shifts. I walked deliberately toward a small maintenance closet near the freight elevator, reaching inside to retrieve a worn, stiff-bristled broom. I stepped back out onto the expansive concrete floor, gripping the wooden handle with both hands, and began to rhythmically sweep the fine industrial dust across the loading dock. I am a multi-millionaire with absolute control over a vast, internationally recognized intelligence and logistics empire. I possess the financial and tactical resources to crush violent crime syndicates and ruin corrupt executives without ever leaving my boardroom. Yet I stood alone in the dim light of the warehouse, sweeping my own floors with methodical precision. I did this because I possess an absolute, unbreakable respect for the humble foundation I meticulously built with my own two hands. True power does not require a stage, a spotlight, or an audience to validate its existence. It is forged in silence, maintained with discipline, and exercised only when absolutely necessary to protect what genuinely matters. Arrogance is a fragile mask worn by the weak to project an illusion of control, while authentic strength operates invisibly, completely immune to superficial external judgment. When you build your life on a foundation of unyielding principles rather than fragile ego, you become completely untouchable. Never confuse loud displays of wealth with genuine capability. The most dangerous force in the room is always the quietest. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below, like this video, and subscribe to the channel to uncover more incredible stories of resilience and justice.